4th of July. We now come to the business of the day. Debate on hospice and palliative care. Paul Kohler to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would first like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting time for this important debate, and colleagues from across the House for supporting my application and joining me today to discuss a subject which, to use an old cliché but in no more apposite context, is truly a matter of life and death. When this House debated the Terminally Ill Adults End-of-Life Bill last November, the crisis in hospice funding and concerns over the provision of palliative care was a constant refrain, forming the subtext of many of the speeches from both supporters and opponents of the bill. As someone who entered the chamber that morning undecided as to how I would vote, I became increasingly convinced throughout the 5 hours of powerful argument and testimony that no matter what the House decided, the time had come to address the issue of hospice funding and the provision of palliative care head-on. For death is as much a part of life as living. Whilst as parliamentarians we readily focus on what makes a good life, we rarely consider what makes a good death. It's absolutely possible to have a good death, as I saw with my mother, who passed away in comfort at the beautiful Arthur Rank Hospice in Cambridge, and my father, who died in the exceptional palliative care facility at Bellevue Hospital in New York. As a family, we remember those times as sad but cathartic, with moments of laughter as well as tears, as when my father, somewhat confused toward the end of life, but with a glint still in his eye, asked as I sat next to him, stroking his forehead, whether I was a lady friend. Sadly, however, too many in our society do not experience a good death, and we need to start asking why. The Honourable Member of Spen Valley bravely took on that challenge in her private member's bill, and I hope this debate will afford us an opportunity to build on those foundations. Of course.
And does he agree with me that the renewed focus on the hospice and palliative care sectors is extremely welcome and indeed overdue, and that the extra £100 million of investment shows how seriously this government is taking this issue, ensuring that people approaching the end of life are fully supportive in whatever choices they choose to make at the end of life?
Thank you. I do agree. I do indeed agree with it with Honourable Lane, and I will be coming to those points further, but yes, I do agree. Today is consequently not about rehashing the arguments made that Friday, but to allow honourable members time to discuss and reflect on this separate but inextricably linked subject. Not the last word on hospice and palliative care, but an important step in forging a consensus that I hope will unite us, no matter where we ultimately stand on assisted dying. I began by referencing the crisis in hospice funding. Before I proceed further, I want to echo what the member of Spen Valley just said and thank the Health Secretary for the £100 million in capital and digital monies he announced last month. It will make a profound difference to the sector's current financial position. I've been asked both by individual hospices and Hospice UK to convey their genuine gratitude. In a similar vein, the government's recently announced commitment to extend the Children's Hospice grant by a further year is deeply appreciated and equally vital to maintaining levels of service in this heart-rending and profoundly important part of the hospice movement. However, these are only short-term fixes and to fail to provide the long-term funding and certainty critical to securing the future of the hospice movement. Currently, only 1/3 of hospice funding is provided by the government, with the rest coming from charitable sources, leaving hospices vulnerable to increased cost pressures, as can be seen from a recent Hospice UK survey which found at least 20% of hospices have either cut services in the last year or are planning to do so. Becca Trower, the clinical director of the wonderful St Raphael's Hospice, which provides excellent care to residents in my Wimbledon constituency, was unambiguous when she told me, "We have a funding crisis and we need to protect our hospice." Last year, that meant St Raphael's was forced to strip £1 million from its £6.5 million budget by ending its hospice at home service, which provided vital care, advice and support to patients and carers in their own home. A virtual ward, in fact, but not one that fitted within the NHS definition of such, so as to track the separate ICB funding available for such initiatives. In just 1 month, the cuts to this service directly impacted 26 patients, many of whom spent their last days taking up valuable hospital beds, dying in the one place they did not want to die, and putting further pressure on the NHS. It makes no sense at a time when the government is aiming to move medicine into the community for hospices to be forced into a position that achieves the opposite. A contradiction mirrored in the current funding settlement, where the government has given with one hand, but taken with the other by increasing employers' national insurance contributions. The refusal to exempt charities will exacerbate the challenges confronting hospices, with the amazing Shooting Star Children's Hospice, for example, which provides wonderful support for families in my constituency, estimating this will add another £200,000 to next year's cost basis. Hospices need certainty. Doubts over funding undermine morale and saps energy, making both recruitment and retention of staff another huge issue for the sector. To address these problems, the government needs to introduce a consistent, reliable funding mechanism which reflects the rising costs of care. Hospices consequently need to be included within the NHS's much anticipated 10-year health plan, while, in parallel with this, their staffing needs must be addressed in the next NHS long-term workforce plan. It should not be forgotten, hospices provide a variety of services in addition to palliative care, including emotional, psychological and spiritual support, physio and occupational therapy, practical support, complementary therapies, respite care and bereavement services. Much of this is beyond the clinical and not something the NHS can be expected nor can afford to provide. That is why no one I spoke to in the hospice movement thought hospices should be subsumed within the NHS. They provide a complementary service which extends well beyond the clinical and to which a charitable funding model is both more effective and appropriate.
Would John give way?
Of course.
Can I commend them for for setting the scene so very well? One of the concerns that I have and others in the Chamber will have is the impact upon the workers in hospice. It's about not just about the financial implications, which is all part of the overall issue, but it's the issue of burnout. Staff are working long hours. They're doing that because they're volunteers in many cases, but they're doing that because that's what they're committed to. And does he share my concern that those who are doing that, that the burnout in hospice care will have an impact on the NHS in the long term?
Thank you for that intervention. I do indeed agree with the Honourable Member. We need more palliative care specialists, we need more training, and there's a real danger of burnout at the moment. Where I got to, I forget, but I think I finished that page. It is not just hospices which provide palliative care, of course, and in talking to specialists both within and beyond the hospice sector, I've been struck by their commitment to giving patients a good death and their frustration that so many do not receive one. As a palliative care doctor recently told The Guardian, I sometimes see patients who come into hospital in unspeakable agony and want their lives to end. It is not because their pain cannot be prevented, but because they are not getting the care they need. While a local oncologist told me, demand for services is simply outstripping supply. The majority of patients are not getting their end-of-life care wishes met. The specialist palliative care teams are very good. There are not enough of them, and they do not have adequate resources. Huge regional inequalities also exist in the provision and quality of services due to the vagaries of the current funding model. The Health and Care Act 2022 included for the first time a statutory duty for ICBs to provide palliative care. However, it did not include a minimum standard of core provision, leaving it to what each ICB considers appropriate. Freedom of information requests submitted by Hospice UK in 2023 found that adult hospice funding consequently ranged from just 23p to £10.33 per head of population across different ICBs. For children's hospices, the variations were even starker, Research from the amazing charity Together for Short Lives found spending per child with a life-limiting condition varying from an average of £531 in Norfolk and Waveney to just £28 in South Yorkshire.
On that note, will the gentleman give way?
Of course.
I thank you for giving way. On that point about the postcode lottery, and I know it's a very oft-used cliche by politicians, as I've heard speaking to Hospice UK, a single gift from a legacy covers the running costs for a hospice in the UK for, I think, for 5 years, and has done on one occasion. Does the honourable member agree that this example is one of the starkest extreme illustrations of how the current system is so unbalanced and leaves people living from street to street with such disparities of access to such an important element of healthcare?
Thank you for that intervention. I do indeed agree, and we'll be coming to some solutions that might address this issue, because we must increase the core responsibilities of ICBs in this area. Inevitably, much palliative care is provided not by specialists, but generalists, such as GPs, trainee doctors and community nurses, whom care of the dying is not their primary focus, many lacking the training, time and resources needed to provide what is possible. Not through their fault, but due to a system that does not regard palliative care as a core function. This is something all too evident at the outset of their careers, with one medical student telling me, "I only received 2 mandatory days training on palliative care in my entire degree. This is simply not enough, and we need to increase training across the board to ensure patients are given equal access to high-quality care." Since the Shipman case, there is also unacceptable legal uncertainty, particularly amongst non-palliative care specialists, as to the extent to which analgesics can be given in sufficient quantity to alleviate pain, even where that might hasten death. The system requires complete overhaul. We need more palliative care specialists and better training for non-specialists, including robust advice on the legality of giving sufficient pain relief to alleviate suffering, buttressed, if deemed necessary and appropriate, by more explicit guidance in the DPP's Code for Crown Prosecutors and the Lord Chief Justice Criminal Practice Directions. Whilst ICBs should be required to provide a minimum level of palliative care as a core function. This would have a transformative effect on how palliative care is funded, both within and beyond the hospice sector, rather than leaving it to the generosity of particular ICBs, such as South West London and Surrey Heartlands, both of which do all they can to fund local hospices, but within the constraints of a funding model that necessarily limits their abilities to do so. In concluding, I want to return to where I began. The debate is a matter of life and death. Ensuring a good death is not just important for the individual and at the end of their life, but for those they leave behind. Knowing someone passed away peacefully can bring real comfort to those mourning their loss. If I may, Madam Speaker, I'd like to end with the words of Fleur, whose son received end-of-life care at the wonderful Shooting Star Hospice. "Hospices are not just places where life comes to a close," she said. "They are places where those left behind learn how to keep on living. When my son Toby died, our hospice didn't just care for him, it cared for all of us, to give us a future not defined by trauma, but by love, resilience and hope. Months later, when my daughter had to step back into a hospital, the place where we had first been told we would lose Toby, she froze, overwhelmed by fear and grief. But when she returned to the hospice, the very place where Toby had taken his last breath, she ran inside, kicked off her shoes and threw herself into the arms of a nurse. That is what it's possible to achieve. I hope the government is listening. Thank you."
The question is, as on the order paper, I call Harpreet Uppal.
Thank you, Deputy Madam Speaker, and it's an absolute honour to follow the Honourable Member for Wimbledon, and what a wonderfully poignant speech. And thank you for bringing this debate forward. As the Member of Parliament for Huddersfield, I've had the privilege of witnessing firsthand the exceptional work of hospices such as Forget Me Not, Children's Hospice and the Kirkwood. These organisations are lifelines for individuals and families facing life-limiting conditions. I welcome the recent announcement of the expansion of hospice funding, which is a crucial step in addressing the financial challenges these vital organisations face. Hospices like Forget-Me-Not and the Kirkwood don't just offer medical care. They provide emotional, psychological and practical support to patients and their families. They ensure dignity and compassion at every step of the journey, addressing the full spectrum of needs for those they care for. Steve, a local dad whose son, 10-year-old Ethan, received support from the Forget-Me-Not Hospice, spoke of its life-changing work for Ethan, but also for the whole family. Steve said, when he's here, he's comfortable. It's a lovely environment, it's not clinical, and he's treated like a normal person. They are not just care providers, but community builders, offering spaces of comfort and support during life's most difficult times. Huddersfield University is also leading on joint work with local hospices in Huddersfield on research and clinical practice on end-of-life care. This includes the university working with the Kirkwood Hospice to create a postgraduate certificate in the end-of-life care, the first of its kind in the UK to link with a hospice. And whilst I'm sat next to the Honourable Member for Spen Valley, I have to pay tribute to her for the way she has conducted the debate on her bill, the Terminally Ill Adults End-of-Life Bill. There's no doubt that she has moved the debate on funding for hospice care. Thank you very much. The expansion of hospice funding is significant and a welcome development, but we must also acknowledge that many hospices, including those in my constituency, still face immense financial pressures. Forget-Me-Not Children's Hospice has recently launched an urgent appeal to address a £1 million funding gap. This expansion of funding must be also part of a larger ongoing strategy to ensure long-term commission funding for hospices is part of the 10-year NHS plan.
My honourable friend give way.
I will.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. St Leonard's Hospice in my constituency of York Outer lovingly cared for my uncle last year in his final weeks with extraordinary compassion. I hear her calls for hospices in her constituency. Will she agree with me that because of the empathy that they have and the important work that they do, we must all campaign for the funding that our hospices desperately need?
I absolutely do, and can I pass on my condolences to you and your family, and also pay tribute to the local hospice and the work that they have done to support your family. I also want to raise the 26 million NHS England funding for children's hospices, formerly the Children's Hospice Grant. Traditionally, this funding was distributed centrally by NHS England, but as has previously been mentioned, it has been disseminated by integrated care boards, but it has caused delays to many children's hospices accessing their funding, including Forget-Me-Not. It is critical that this funding is ring-fenced for children's hospices, and I hope the Minister will review if it can again be centrally distributed to avoid further delays. The new funding for hospices is an important milestone, and can I welcome the Government's approach to this and thank the Minister for the work he has done. I know the hospice sectors very much welcomes this additional funding, but can it also mark the beginning of further government support for these essential services? Hospices are an integral, I can't say it. Apologies, integral is getting a bit late for me now, it's Monday evening, of our healthcare system, and we must ensure they have the resources and support they need to continue their vital work, including the specialist doctors and nurses that are needed amongst many hospices. Madam Deputy Speaker, together through government action, community support and the tireless effort of hospice staff and volunteers, we can ensure that hospices not only survive but thrive, continuing to provide the compassion and dignity that every individual deserves. Thank you.
I call Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First, I must congratulate the Honourable Member from Wimbledon for securing this debate. I can tell him, as a member of the Backbench Business Committee, I can tell him he was a very convincing argument and to secure the debate. Like others, I suspect, during the course of the evening, one of my aims is to praise my local hospices, Lindsay Lodge in Scunthorpe and St Andrews in Grimsby, both of which provide care to my constituents. I have a particular affection for St Andrews because my father passed away in their care, and my mother actually died on the day she was supposed to be moving into St Andrews. So, as I say, I've got a particular affection for them. That is over 30 years ago, and I've seen how they developed over the years since, and they continue to provide absolutely superb care. And of course the demand is increasing. Demographics have changed, people are living longer, and of course they do actually ease the burden on the NHS. St Andrews has a staff of 133 permanent staff, but over 400 volunteers. As it happens, I visited St Andrews last Friday, a meeting that was scheduled some weeks ago, but so it's very convenient for this, and I do have a specific question for the Minister relating to St Andrews, which I will come to later. Voluntary donations in areas such as North East Lincolnshire are crucial, as they are elsewhere. But of course, with relatively low incomes and property values very low, when people leave a legacy of a share of their property perhaps, that doesn't realise the same sort of return as it would do in many parts of the country. St Andrews, I could give a whole list of what they provide, but one or two significant statistics are that they have over 3,000 adult inpatient bed nights and 694 children's hospice home sessions. They provide physiotherapy, creative therapy, they have social work contacts. They provide spiritual care for those of their patients and their families. The cost of operating all parts of the charity in 2024-25 is over £18,000 per day, and only 4 years ago it was £14,000 a day, a significant rise, as you will appreciate, 80% of which has to be earned or raised by the hospice, and in times of economic challenge it's increasingly difficult. The statutory income for the year 24-25 is expected to be only 21.5% of their total income. And currently, for every pound of statutory income, St Andrews has to raise £4.60, adding a very considerable financial challenge for the hospice, the volunteers and the fundraisers. And as we know, healthcare inflation does indeed run ahead of general inflation, and they have, of course, to try to keep pace with statutory salary increases to do with the national minimum wage. But of course, as with social enterprises which provide social care in North East Lincolnshire, the staff do not automatically get the increases that go to NHS workers. And inevitably the gap is widening. I did actually raise this at Health Questions with the Secretary of State last week, and I think it's going to be a growing problem as NHS wage increases again later this year. The gap between those providing care in the hospice and in the social care and the social enterprise businesses widens, and it will be about 10% by the time the next increase comes. And that, needless to say, is causing difficulties for those employees. So my specific question for the Minister, and I will write to him in the next day or two, because I don't expect that he's got all the details of St Andrews in his pack there, is that because of historical reasons, St Andrews only gets 21% of its income through statutory contributions, which I understand is about 12% below the national average. And this has come about by a whole series of historical adjustments that have taken place. And my plea to the Minister is that St Andrews is brought up to the national average as soon as possible. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Paulette Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the member for Wimbledon for securing this important debate? As a nurse for 25 years and co-chair of the Hospice APPG, hospice and palliative care have always been at the heart of my work, both in this chamber and in my community. I would like to start by acknowledging the fantastic decision by the government to boost investment in hospices by £100 million, the largest funding uplift in a generation. This is a clear sign that the government is listening to the hospice sector and that they are responding with actions, not just words. But this uplift must be the beginning and not the end. This new money won't last forever. We must take concrete steps now to ensure the awful conditions of the hospice sector, which we inherited, are never repeated. It is also worth noting that the member for York Central recent Independent Commission on Palliative Care and End-of-Life Care, while welcome, is mainly about delivery, not funding. We simply cannot wait for a palliative care task force to complete their report, which could take months of time, which this sector cannot spare. In my role, I hear time and time again about postcode lotteries and the chronic lack of funding plaguing this vital sector. For example, John Taylor Hospice in my constituency does fantastic work, and through no fault of their own, they are facing a crisis in funding and have announced redundancies and the reduction in inpatient beds due to the funding shortfall. This story is repeated all over the country. I'm sure many members in this chamber they have a similar situation that they could share. Hospice care still relies heavily on charity. Bake sales and donations funded much of the work that supports families during some of their most vulnerable moments. This must change. This postcode lottery is not just unfair, it undermines the principles of universal health care. We cannot allow end-of-life care to depend on where you live and how much money you have. Hospices across the UK provide care and support to 300,000 people every year. They are an absolute essential part of our healthcare system, although they're in the charity sector. Every single day, hospices face rising costs of energy, food and medicine. Every single day, they deliver exceptional care, even as pressures mount. And every single day, they battle deficits that threaten their ability to continue. Despite all of these challenges, hospices save the NHS millions each year by alleviating pressures on hospitals and providing community-based care. However, their ability to continue this vital work is at risk, and they need long-term sustainable support. We need to face the future head-on and fix their funding model in a permanent manner. While I absolutely understand that hospices are under pressure, integrated care boards who fund them are similarly under a great deal of pressure due to year-on-year budget reductions from NHS England. Asking ICBs to fund extra money without it being allocated centrally as revenue is impossible. Madam Deputy Speaker, death is a part of life, as the member for Wimbledon said. As we all know, Nobody would say we should neglect healthcare. So why are we neglecting the hospice sector by not securing a sustainable funding formula? To truly address the gaps in our system, we need a sustainable funding model that ensures hospices can meet the growing demands without being forced to cut services. The people of this country deserve a future where every family, no matter their circumstances, can access the highest quality of end-of-life care without worry. One where hospice care is not a postcode lottery, but a promise. Madam Deputy Speaker, let us turn this moment into an opportunity. We must act urgently to implement an improved and sustainable funding package for hospices and palliative care. With constructive action, we can build a system that uplifts the most vulnerable among us, that strengthens the NHS, and that shows the best of what we can achieve as a nation. So let's ensure that the legacy of this debate is not one of uncertainty, but one of determination, passion, and that when we see the 10-year plan, hospice and palliative care will be fully funded going forward. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Munira Wilson.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Wimbledon, for securing this debate, and thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. As he stated, this debate has taken on an added salience since the honourable lady, the member for Batley and Spen, brought forward her bill on assisted dying. But I hope we can all agree that regardless of what happens to the passage of that bill, there is an urgent need to address hospice and palliative care in this country. And so I just want to touch briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, on 2 points. One is around children's hospice funding and support, and the other is just more broadly on inequalities in access to palliative care, which is also related to some of the concerns that many of us have about the terminally ill adults end-of-life bill. Now, on children's hospices, I'm very proud to have Shooting Star Children's Hospice in my constituency in Hampton, which my honourable friend, the member for Wimbledon, referred to. As he stated, as well as serving children and young people and their families in my constituency, actually serves a very wide area of South West and West London, and indeed all of Surrey. They provide care and support to children with life-limiting conditions. They provide respite care, family support, and importantly, they also provide a bereavement service. And I know from talking to the mother of a teenager who died very, very unexpectedly from an asthma attack in my constituency, that her young teenage friends have been very well supported by Shooting Star as they've been grieving their friend who so unexpectedly and tragically lost her life. And so I just want to take this opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to pay tribute to Shooting Star for their incredible work. Like other hospices, as we've heard, they rely on the goodwill and generosity of so many in our community and beyond, skydiving, running, donating clothes and toys to their shops. As my honourable friend from the member for Wimbledon pointed out, they now face a £200,000 bill as a result of the employer's national insurance rise. And whilst they welcome the Health Secretary's announcement prior to Christmas to renew the Children's Hospice grant, I would reiterate their question, which was echoed by my honourable friend for Wimbledon: is this a long-term commitment, not just for the next financial year? They've told me time and again they cannot plan for the future if they're living hand to mouth year to year in terms of recruiting staff and putting services in place. And will it be ring-fenced as well? Hospice funding is so variable, and Together for Short Lives, as we've heard, have reported that NHS funding in 2022-23 for children varied by as much as £483 per child. And Hospice UK also did a Freedom of Information request, which shockingly found that a number of ICBs, about 14%, have absolutely no idea how much they're spending on children's palliative care. We need to hold our ICBs much more accountable for palliative care, both children and adult palliative care. Together for Short Lives have also highlighted a £295 million spending gap in NHS spending on children's palliative care when compared against NICE standards. And Madam Deputy Speaker, that brings me to my second substantive point around the variability of palliative care, particularly with regards to how they compare to national standards. Marie Curie estimates that 1 in 4 people who could benefit from specialist palliative end-of-life care do not receive it. Now, you are more likely to get good palliative care, frankly, if you are richer, if you are more educated, if you are white, and if you are younger. These inequalities across our society in terms of access to palliative care are growing, and the demand is growing too. And it is because of these inequalities that I really struggled. It's one of many reasons, and I had a number of conversations with the Honourable Member for Batley and Spen, why I could not support her bill at second reading. And these inequalities really, really concern me. And when you look at the fact that back in 2011, so getting on for 14 years ago, NICE recommendations that there should be a designated palliative care advice line out of hours implemented in every area of the country, but only 1 in 3 areas of the country offer that. That shows you just how poor we are at putting in place what we've already been told needs to be provided so that people can die a good death. If that happened in any other area of care, particularly in cancer, there would rightly, absolutely rightly, be outrage that we weren't implementing those NICE recommendations. The 2024 Marie Curie Better End of Life report said that large numbers of people were struggling to access services. There was late recognition of their needs and poor communication. It found the impact on carers of the poor end-of-life care was also profound. The physical and emotional toll that it took on carers left one carer saying, the overall experience is that no one really cares. Madam Deputy Speaker, when we are at our most vulnerable at end of life and our loved ones are also struggling, we deserve so much better. And so we need far greater investment in palliative care and in hospice care. And I urge the Minister to take genuine action to address both the geographic disparities but also the deep inequalities that exist in terms of accessing palliative care. And I urge him to do this regardless of whether the bill on assisted dying makes progress or not. But particularly so if it does, because we have a moral imperative. We cannot be, and this is the thing that really grated with me most and why I could not walk through that eye lobby that day, we cannot be in a position that an assisted death is available universally on the NHS to those identified in the bill, but access to good palliative care is not. So I urge him to make commitments, and I urge the Bill Committee to make sure that there are duties written into law to ensure that there is genuine choice at the end of life. And whether that bill passes or not, we need to see much greater action on good palliative care. Thank you.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first thank the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for securing this important debate and also his passionate contribution. It is shocking that on average only 1/3 of hospice funding is provided by government, with the rest coming from charitable donations. But rising costs, inconsistent income and a shortage of state funding has left the hospice sector in a precarious position. Indeed, many have had to cut back on the services they can offer and are struggling to meet the growing need. The recent all-parliamentary group on hospices made for a sobering experience for all MPs present, with every single representative from the hospice sector outlining fear around the future. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am blessed to have both Clare House and Zoe's Place Children's Hospices in my constituency of Liverpool West Derby, but we witnessed firsthand last year the seriousness of the situation with hospices with the threatened closure of Zoe's Place, which rocked us all to the core of my great city. To lose something so precious to our community was unthinkable, but because of the lack of funding raised in these challenging conditions, it was going to happen. The community of Liverpool and beyond rose to the challenge to save Zoe's Place when it was faced with closure by raising an incredible £5 million in 30 days to ensure that this incredible place could remain open. While I have the chance, I would like to thank in the Chamber every single individual and organisation who worked relentlessly to make this happen. Without you all and the City of Liverpool, we would have lost Zoe's Place. So many to name, but I'd like to thank Steve Morgan Foundation, the 64 Trust and TJ Morris for underpinning this remarkable community effort. But we shouldn't have had to do this. I'm pleased that in December the government recognised the crisis faced by hospices and committed 126 million to the sector, with 100 million of one-off funding and a one-year extension of the Children's Hospice grant. But this is still only a stick and plaster. Hospices need consistent, reliable funding that accurately reflects the cost of care and their value in society, to be able to meet the growing demand for palliative and end-of-life care and ensure people have the best possible experience at the end of their life and prevent future funding crisis. Madam Deputy Speaker, hospice sector's leaders have estimated that the need for palliative care in the UK will increase by 25% over the next 25 years. It is clear there needs to be a long-term reform of the hospice funding model to ensure that this demand can be met. And that's why I back calls from the Hospice UK for government to commit to a long-term reform of hospice funding in its 10-year plan for the NHS. So today, a couple of questions for the Minister, who has been absolutely superb in his support of me on Zoe's Place. Will the government ensure that the confirmed 26 million NHS England funding for children's hospices for 25-26 is ring-fenced, distributed centrally and increased in line with inflation in subsequent years? And does the Minister recognise the strong preference among children's hospices for the £26 million of NHS funding to be distributed as centrally managed and ring-fenced grants rather than go and distributed by the ICBs? Without ongoing government support and a fresh funding model, what nearly happens as always placed Liverpool will happen elsewhere. Hospices will undoubtedly close down. The problems are systematic and it's going to take government action to fix that. The City of Liverpool rose to the challenge to save Zoe's Place. Now this place has to rise to the challenge as well and give all hospices the funding they need to survive. This cannot wait, because all who rely on these incredible services do not have time on their side. Thank you.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to first of all pay tribute to the member for Wimbledon for securing this important debate and for his heartfelt contribution. I imagine there isn't anyone in this House, or perhaps even across these islands, whose lives haven't been touched by hospice care. I want to personally pay tribute to my niece, Dr. Roisin Etchells, who works in this field. Recently, this House had what was, by all accounts, a respectful, informed and emotional debate on the concept of assisted dying, thanks to the efforts of the Honourable Member for Spen Valley. Perversely, this government has introduced additional employer national insurance contribution charges on the independent hospice sector. Yeah. This can only be described as an attack, an assault on the very concept of assisted dying as we currently deliver it. For that is what hospice care is and does, and what others who deliver palliative care in the independent sector within the community do. In Scotland, one of the leading providers of such care, both in residential settings and in the community, i.e. within people's homes, is Marie Curie. They operate at least 2 residential services and community care in almost every local authority area in Scotland. Here I declare an interest as a proud supporter of Marie Curie and as someone who has helped raise very significant funds for them. They do such wonderful work. They provide skilled care and brighten the lives of patients as they face the prospect of their last weeks. days and hours. Ask any family who has benefited from this support. I defy anyone to find a critic. Of course, I understand that the government must balance their books and that public sector pay rises must be funded. But the failure to offer mitigations in key areas of these self-same public sector services is misguided, ill-informed, clumsy and counterproductive. Members opposite will cry, where will we find the money for these services then? Well, ministers know there are alternatives, but in their populist haste to win the trust of the electorate, they rashly promise not to increase income tax. But look at Scotland, where those with the broadest shoulders pay a little more, where in every tax bracket, more people are coming to Scotland to pay their taxes there every year, where 60% of taxpayers pay less than their counterparts in the rest of this disunited kingdom, and where the government responsible for this alleged mismanagement has enjoyed public support for close to 20 years and continues to do so. We in the SNP estimate that if the UK government had matched the Scottish tax bands, they could have raised £16 billion. In the recently announced Scottish budget, it was encouraging to see that the Scottish Government committed to increase hospice funding by £4 million and to provide additional funding for hospice staff to match NHS pay awards. To me, this is the difference between the Scottish and the UK governments. While the UK government hikes national insurance on employers and votes against amendments to exempt hospices from this hike, the Scottish Government increases funding and puts more money in the pockets of hospice healthcare workers. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I, like other Scottish MPs, probably received a heartfelt plea from CHAS, the Children's Hospice Service in Scotland. And if you had read that, Minister, you would know how desperate their situation is. I implore the Government to think again, to engage with the Scottish Government to ascertain the cost of mitigations for hospice and palliative care service providers and others, and to provide the same mitigating support which has been given to the NHS and other public services in Scotland. Thank you.
Sarah Russell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to, as others have done, pay tribute to my local hospices, St Luke's and East Cheshire, both of which do a spectacular job and are very, very well loved local institutions. I'd like to say a particular thank you to the staff, of course, but also to the volunteers and the donors who are quite literally keeping the lights on. I absolutely welcome the £100 million of capital that the government has funded to provide to hospices, and I'd like to ask the Minister to please meet with me and my colleagues, the MPs for Crewe, Mid-Cheshire and Macclesfield, to discuss a potential local project. In terms of revenue funding, though, I would be remiss of me if I didn't mention that St Luke's and East Cheshire Hospice receive 15 and 16% respectively of their funding from the NHS. I would like to ask the Minister to please review and commit to a funding floor that is transparent, fair and consistent across the country. The quality of experience that my constituents and their families have at the end of their lives should not be dependent on the generosity of individuals.
Dr Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Wimbledon for speaking so eloquently in this important debate and securing it, and of course to the Backbench Business Committee. I'd like to start just by saying hospices are fantastic places, and all of us in this country are lucky to have them. And one of the ways I think about them is people don't go to hospices to die, they go to hospices to live during the last few days or weeks of their lives. And while I'm pleased that the assisted dying bill has led to a renewed interest in hospice and palliative care, I'm sad that a lot of the focus has been around death and the dying process specifically, rather than the broad support and care that hospices and palliative care provides, sometimes over many years, for people who have illnesses which may be life-limiting but require certain particular types of interventions, medical interventions, to manage symptoms for people. And I think that's a very important part of the work that hospices and palliative care teams do, but often get sort of often a lot of the focus is on the death process itself, rather than the overall sort of chronic treatment that's given. And I think one of the important parts of that is, of course, speaking as a former consultant psychiatrist, is I'd be remiss of me not to mention the psychological support and mental health interventions that palliative care teams and hospices bring. Experts in terms of pain relief, and I tell you, as a junior doctor, palliative care teams brought a lot of relief to me when trying to manage very difficult situations with patient care, and they are the experts in terms of the analgesic and that component, and I think that it's important to recognise them not only in terms of hospice, but also in terms of the palliative care teams that operate both in hospital settings, but also in the community supporting people's symptoms. Of course, I want to pay tribute to our fantastic hospices and care teams which we have locally in the Runnymede and Weybridge constituency. Woking and Sandbear Hospice, which I've visited, which is a fantastic place, and Princess Alice, which is based in Esher, and we also benefit from Shooting Stars, which is in the member for Twickenham's constituency, and I hope to visit that one day too. I'd like to thank all the teams who work in there, both in terms of delivering care and support to people, but also keeping the hospices running and the vital fundraising which they do. Many people support hospices in lots of different ways, whether that's direct donations, whether that's organising fundraising events, and I'm pleased to have been to fundraising events myself for Woking and Sandbear Hospice. In fact, just a few weeks ago, roughly about a week or two ago, I went to the Chertsey Panto, which has been running now for 12 years, supporting the Woking and Sandbear Hospice, and it's around, at least what was announced, that the performance people who visit the Panto window performance, if one can call it that, would recognise they've raised 60 grand over the period of time. And for those members who'd like to see the Chertsey Panto, I have to say it is a panto which has to be seen to believed, and one never will forget the Chertsey Panto after one has gone to it. But the team who organise and run it are absolutely fantastic. It's a fantastic institution and raises a lot of good money for the Woking and Sandbear Hospice. Also, we have territory shops, for example. There's a great one in Weybridge which has been raising money for quite some time for that. So I'd like to pay tribute to everybody, no matter how big or how small, what they do in terms of supporting our hospices and our palliative care sector. Of course.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Will he join me in promoting St Wilfrid Hospice's fundraiser in Eastbourne? I'm a CEO, Get Me Out of Here, that's trying to get lots of local CEOs and MPs to join them in the Sussex jungle to raise cash for the great work that they do.
Well, I thank the member for his intervention. He'll have to explain more to me what exactly is required in terms of a commitment in the Sussex jungle for the fundraising. But he's right to pay tribute to the great work which is done supporting our hospice sector. And of course, their funding model is part public, part privately supported. And I think that adds a great benefit to them, because sitting outside the NHS, they have a more degree of flexibility in terms of how they approach care provision. That being said, Woking and Sandbear is 31% funded by public sector money. It has 2,000 staff and delivers, as I said, delivers fantastic care and support. But much of this debate has been around what the future is for our hospice sector in terms of funding. And while I'm grateful for the government in terms of some of the money and support it's put forwards towards hospice, sadly it has given with one hand and taken away with the other. The national insurance contributions is very damaging. The hospice also need to manage increasing staffing budgets through Agenda for Change. Marie Currie has said that this is going to cost the sector, the national insurance component, roughly 2.9 million per year. And so what I would like to ask the Minister if he could, in his closing responding statements, explain what impact assessment has been done on the national insurance contribution rises for hospices, the agenda for change, and how many hospices in the UK are currently running in a deficit position, and how he expects that to change over the course of the next year and going forwards as a consequence of the decisions that were made on the budget. And if there is an opportunity for those decisions to be reversed, does he support them? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Liam Conlon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for securing today's debate as well. I'm incredibly proud of many things in Beckenham and Penge, but particularly St Christopher's Hospice. St Christopher's Hospice was founded by Dame Cecily Saunders in 1967, and Dame Cecily Saunders was also the founder of the global hospice movement. The hospice movement came about because Dame Cecily, a nurse who was researching pain control, believed that more could be done to help people at the end of their lives. That included physical symptoms, including tackling stigma around painkillers, but also that people should be able to achieve emotional closure through individualised care and support. The assisted dying debate has been mentioned today by many members across the House. I had over 2,000 constituents contact me about that debate, roughly 50-50 split in terms of whether they supported or opposed the bill, but every single one of them was united by compassion, and every single one of them often relayed experiences of seeing people at the end of their lives. But I also want to mention a particular tribute this evening to a woman I was incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to work for in this place, Dame Tessa Jowl. Tessa was a very good friend, she was a mentor, she was an amazing boss, and 6 years ago next week she made her final speech in this place. Tessa was diagnosed with a terminal brain tumour. I spent the entire time from her diagnosis through to writing the press release on the night she died with her. And she finished her speech in the other place by saying that in the end, what gives a life meaning is not only how it is lived, but how it draws to a close. And I sincerely believe that. And St Christopher's Hospice gives meaning to life as it draws to a close. It does so because it takes a holistic approach, caring for a patient's physical, spiritual, and psychological well-being. I've seen firsthand the intimate bonds and relationships that are established between staff, volunteers, patients, and families. They are also one of the largest providers of palliative care education in the world. And for all of these reasons, across Beckenham and Penge, we all support St Christopher's Hospice. They are a huge part of our community. I was fundraising for the hospice long before I became an MP, and I continue to do so. And people help in lots of different ways, and I'd like to give a special mention to Penge Fest, which is South East London's answer to Oktoberfest. Local businesses like Brewery, the Three Hounds, Designer Drapes, Friends of Cater Park, Penge Bid, and many more come together with local residents for a day of fun and fundraising. This included an Oompa band that brought Penge High Street to a standstill last summer. And we'll continue to fundraise for St Christopher's Hospice, but we shouldn't have to for the basics. It benefits everyone, from the NHS to patients, to support our hospices. And that's why I'd like to welcome the announcement from the government just before Christmas of an extra £100 million in hospice funding. The extension of children's hospice grants. This will ease the strain on hospices, benefit patients, as well as the wider health and care systems. But I know that hospices are still facing pressures, including increased demand for services, the rising cost of provision, and discrepancies in funding across the country, as many members have made those points this evening. That's why, as the Minister recognises, hospices must be a key part in the government's plan to shift care into the community, including through their provision of at-home care services which can ease the acute pressures on the NHS. I'd like to invite the Minister to visit St Christopher's to see their fantastic work for himself and to discuss the role of hospices in the government's commitment to ensure that every person has access to high quality end-of-life care. Thank you again to the Honourable Member for securing today's debate and to the Government for the vital work they are undertaking on this important issue. Thank you.
Susan Murray. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend for securing this debate on this important subject. As I think many people have spoken about, during the assisted dying discussions, it was clear that the one thing that everybody had in common was that a desire to see better palliative care more available across the country. Nearly a third of palliative care in Scotland is delivered by charities, and as we know, that is the same across the UK. In Scotland, hospice charities provide end-of-life care to over 20,000 people a year, ensuring compassion and care at the end of life. And this figure is expected to rise by 40% in the next 15 years. In my constituency in Mid-Dunbartonshire, we don't have a hospice located within the boundaries, but we have many people who work and volunteer in the hospice sector. And there's concern about a lack of understanding of the core role and wide scope of palliative care, which has for too long been funded outside the NHS, despite a fundamental aspect of care. And this has led to shortfall in services, including, as we've heard, for palliative care for children. Madam Deputy Speaker, for too long, hospices have struggled with insufficient funding from consecutive Scottish and UK governments, with less than half the funding for hospice care coming from government sources. And while the £100 million extra is absolutely welcome, there is still a huge shortfall in funding. The national insurance increase is projected to cost Scottish hospices an extra £2.5 million a year. And this is coming at a time where Marie Curie has highlighted that 1 in 4 people across the UK aren't able to access the support they need. This increased financial burden will undoubtedly lead to fewer beds, reduced services, and diminished quality of care for some of our most vulnerable citizens at the end of life. Inevitably, this will compound the effects of staff shortages already faced by the care industry, further straining hospice care providers. Where palliative care is available, there are still shortages, especially in psychological support and spiritual care, plus the possibility of serious recruitment problems, with any assisted dying provision and in the social care structures that support people in their own homes. 14 care providers have already issued an open letter calling for cross-party consensus on sustainable hospice funding. Their plea highlights the urgent need for additional support to ensure these vital institutions are not forced to ration care or to close their doors. I therefore urge the Government to consider exempting hospitals from the recent national insurance hike again, a practical step to alleviate the financial strain on hospices and hospice charities. By doing so, we don't remove crucial funding from palliative care, and this, as we've heard, is often raised by charitable donations. We must support palliative care services and ensure that all who need hospice care can access it, allowing them dignity and compassion in their end-of-life care. Thank you.
I now call Alison Hume.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this important debate, and the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for securing it. I am very grateful the Government has recognised the immense importance of our work in our hospices with the recent announcement of a £100 million funding package for their vital work. In my own constituency of Scarborough and Whitby, we are served by the extraordinary work of St Catherine's Hospice. For 40 years, St Catherine's has supported and lovingly cared for individuals with a terminal illness and their families, not only on site in Scarborough, but also in people's homes within North Yorkshire, covering more than 1,600 square miles. St Catherine's provides an incredible service, and like most hospices around the country, is a charitable, independent organisation largely funded through donations, fundraising and the income from their high street charity shops. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to place on record my sincere thanks to the wonderful staff, the army of selfless volunteers who give freely of their time, and the generosity of local people who all ensure hospice care is available to everyone in the constituency. St Catherine's welcomed our recent funding announcement, but it is clear, however, that one-off capital injections alone will not address the underlying structural funding deficits. At the heart of the issue is the lack of clarity, equity and accountability in how integrated care boards allocate funding. Currently, there is no standard formula for funding distribution, creating disparity across hospices. St Catherine's receives approximately 30% of their funding from the NHS, which is insufficient to meet the growing needs of the community. Some hospices receive much more, while others slightly less. Greater transparency and a consistent framework are needed to ensure equitable funding across all providers, whether NHS or charity-based. This inequity places immense pressure on charitable fundraising and limits what hospices can achieve. St Catherine's alone must raise over £6 million annually. Surely the hospice sector needs funding models that align with service outcomes. A model similar to the Mental Health Investment Standard, mandating a minimum level investment in palliative and end-of-life care, could perhaps provide the consistency and accountability that's so urgently needed. Long-term strategy is equally critical. It is my hope that a 10-year NHS plan will include detailed guidance for ICBs on commissioning hospice care, supported by a national funding strategy that reduces reliance on voluntary contributions for essential services. Dame Cecily Saunders, founder of the modern hospice movement, said, "You matter because you are you until the last moment of your life." Our hospices strive to make every moment matter for patients and their loved ones. We must recognise hospices as integral partners within the healthcare system. By doing so, we will ensure hospices are adequately supported to deliver extraordinary care, both now and in the future.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hospices provide vital care for adults and children with life-limiting conditions, offering end-of-life care, pain management and bereavement support to families. But despite being this essential part of healthcare, the hospice sector has challenges due to the inadequate government funding and taxes that it's putting on it, workforce shortages, and that's all compounded by rising costs and economic uncertainty. Before I became a Member of Parliament, I have to confess I had, perhaps fortunately, very little contact with the hospice sector. That's despite having worked in health and social care for the majority of my career and being a local government councillor for 17 years. But during the election campaign, I was invited to Shooting Star Children's Hospice, which has been mentioned on numerous occasions by members across this House. And I visited Christopher's, which is their in-house care facility in Guildford. I think actually it's in the constituency of the Right Honourable Member for Godalming and Ash. The Honourable Member for Guildford will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong. And there I saw the true meaning of people who are making selfless, day-to-day acts of kindness and care, looking after some of the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable children and their families. The absolute exemplar of people providing dying well. And likewise, Phyllis Tuckwell Hospice in my constituency, which is currently going through a multi-million-pound rebuild, funded by donations from people who have either used or care for our hospice in Farnham. That will provide, when it's open, hopefully by the end of the year, 18 new palliative care beds alongside rehabilitation and services for their families as well, along with therapy sessions. Both, as I said, shining examples of what dying well should look like. And as other honourable members have mentioned, I think the one good thing that has come out of the assisted dying debate has been a much greater focus in this House and indeed across the country on what it means to die well. And I echo some of the comments that have been made around this House, that let's get palliative care and hospice care right first before we start thinking about whether or not we should be allowing people to kill themselves. Now, the reality is that despite the government's announcements just after Christmas, which I would be churlish not to welcome, the reality is that adult hospices and children's hospices are almost totally reliant on charitable donations. Also, the rest comes through the integrated care boards. And as the Honourable Member for Scarborough and Whitby just mentioned, that is a complete postcode lottery. I think as the Honourable Member for, I'm trying to remember where he's from now, my brain's gone. Wimbledon, that's it, should remember, who secured this debate, for which I'm very grateful, mentioned. There is a significant variation of the funding per person, depending on where on the country you are and which of the hospices you are being treated at. And the children's hospice sector is the most stark, with some places funding just under £30, whereas others funding over £500. And this inequity in care leaves some families clearly worse off. But the government really hasn't made it easy for the hospice sector. It's still not clear to me whether the Health Secretary and the Health Department had any clue that the National Insurance contribution changes were going to come down the line. And if they were aware of this, had they allocated this funding before? Was this in their plan? Or have they been scrabbling to try and make up the difference since they heard this announcement? Despite asking questions, I've not heard the answer to this. What we've not also heard is whether actually the government is going to cover the costs of that national insurance contribution rise. My view is, personal view is, they must do, because the hospice sector, alongside so much of the care sector, is absolutely vital, not just to the people who use it, clearly, but also to the wider health economy. Because underfunding and taking money from hospice care will have a significant impact and a higher cost impact on other parts of the health service. Yes, I'm happy to give way.
Thank you very much for giving way to the honourable member. The honourable member seems to be welcoming the additional £100 million to the hospice sector and indeed the additional investment in the NHS that's come out of the budget, but he seems not to be welcoming the way in which that revenue is being raised. How would his party raise the revenue needed for the NHS and for the hospice sector?
Gregory Stafford.
Well, the simple fact is, what the honourable member and his front bench team are doing is actually ensuring that the NHS is worse off, because the money raised will have a greater impact on the rest of it. And the junior minister who's shouting at me from the front bench, I'm sure at the point where he manages to respond to this debate can outline whether or not he and his team knew about the national insurance contribution rises, and will be able to tell us whether he'd planned for doing so. So the other part of this, and I think it's been touched on briefly, is around workforce. And there is a real shortage of qualified healthcare professionals. Vacancy rates for nurses in hospices have risen to nearly 19%. And likewise, the corollary of that is obviously staff morale is low. And again, the government needs to make sure that, as has been mentioned previously, that the long-term workforce plan that is being rolled out by the government and the NHS includes how we ensure that hospice people working in hospices are part of that long-term funding. The reality is, and Hospice UK has warned of this really seriously, is that without urgent action, some, indeed many hospices, may be forced to close their doors in the next 12 months. So I have some requests of the government. First of all, as I think the honourable member from Birmingham Erdington said, we need the government to commit to a long-term sustainable funding model for hospices. That is not to say that they should be brought in to the central NHS, because I personally believe that the innovation that comes from the hospice sector is down to the fact that they are independent from the NHS. But they need to have that multi-year funding to understand where they stand. Second of all, as has been mentioned, we need to scrap this postcode lottery which comes from the ICBs. Some kind of ring-fence funding, particularly, I would say, for the children's hospice grants, would prevent a lot of the delays and inequities in the service. As I've said already, workforce support, we need to make sure that the hospice staff are integrated into the NHS long-term workforce plan and they are paid in parity with similar NHS roles. I welcome the £100 million of capital investment. Yes, of course.
Well, gentleman, for giving way. I wonder if he would pay, along with me, pay tribute to the Phyllis Tuckwell Hospice, which I know does great work in his constituency as it does in mine. I've been speaking to them over the last few days, and they require £25,000 per day in order to maintain their service. And what they say to me is that they desperately need multi-year funding settlements to offer that guarantee of future financial security and a really clearly articulated workforce plan in order to ensure the continuity of high-quality staff. Thank you.
I completely agree with the honourable gentleman. I think I mentioned Phyllis Tuckwell at the beginning of my speech, and so I entirely agree with him. They do fantastic work in Farnham and across Surrey and Hampshire, and like all hospices, I'm sure, around the country, rely on those donations, but require that secure funding from government. Madam Deputy Speaker, to bring myself to a close, I think we just need to remember that hospices are not a nice to have. Palliative care is not a nice to have. They are absolutely essential charitable services. They must be fully integrated into funding and planning frameworks from the Department of Health and the NHS. They provide compassionate, life-changing care to thousands of adults and children every year. However, this vital work is being undermined by short-sighted government policies. If the government is serious about improving end-of-life care and reducing hospital pressures, it must deliver fair funding, address those workforce challenges and ensure that no family is left without the care they need, regardless of where they live. This is not just about numbers. The Minister might listen to this. It's about dignity, it's about compassion, and it's about humanity at the most vulnerable time in people's lives.
Members will have seen that we have some pressure on time this evening, and I do want to get all members in. Before I call the next speaker, I am enforcing an informal 4-minute time limit. Bambos Sharalambos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I wish to congratulate the Honourable Member for Wimbledon on securing this very important and timely debate. The provision of hospices and palliative care is an essential part of our nation's health service, playing a unique and vital role in our communities, often providing services that the NHS simply cannot cater for. We're very fortunate in North London to be served by two amazing hospices, North London Hospice and Noah's Ark Children's Hospice, which provide extraordinary end-of-life care, comfort and dignity for individuals and their families from Enfield, Barnet and Haringey areas. I've had the pleasure of visiting both North London Hospice and Noah's Ark Children's Hospice and have seen firsthand the exceptional services they provide. North London Hospice supports over 4,000 people each year, and its services range from inpatient care to community-based support that allows people to die at home if that is what they wish. They also provide counselling and support and wellbeing therapies. Their community engagement is excellent, and I had the pleasure of attending their Compassionate Neighbour event in December, where the community volunteers befriend and support individuals at the end of their life, providing friendship and help with chores on a regular basis. Similarly, Noah's Ark Children's Hospice, which I visited on Friday, provides a lifeline for children with life-limiting or life-threatening conditions. Their hospice at home service allows children to receive care in familiar surroundings, which is often invaluable for families. I doubt if the services and facilities they provide can be bettered. These organisations are models of good practice, but they're indicative of the challenges hospices face in England today. Both hospices face financial challenges to keep going, and the extraordinary work that their fundraising teams carry out should be highly commended. North London Hospice have a £16 million of running costs every year and could not provide the services that they currently provide without donations and fundraising. And it was an honour to raise funds for North London Hospice when I ran the London Marathon in April of this year, as did many other people to raise money. My time was 5 hours 51. Noah's Ark Children's Hospice have to find a staggering £6.5 million a year to keep going. And they've even talked me into doing some fundraising for them, although I politely declined the skydiving option, fun runs being more my choice of activity for fundraising.
Go on.
I know that the additional £100 million of capital investment for hospices announced by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care is very welcome, as is the £26 million for children and young people's hospices. But with demand for palliative care expected to rise by 25% over the next 25 years, the funding model for hospices needs to be resolved for the long term. While the NHS provides some financial support, this typically only accounts for a fraction of their costs. Moreover, the process of accessing public funding through integrated care boards is fraught with challenges. Hospices must navigate a labyrinth of bureaucracy to secure funding that has often already been allocated to them. Delays, inconsistencies and a lack of transparency in decision-making can leave hospices in financial limbo. We've all seen the extraordinary fundraising efforts undertaken by hospices, but while these activities are inspiring, they also highlight a stark reality. Hospices are being asked to do too much with too little. The current funding model creates a sense of perpetual precocity, with even a slight downturn in donations could possibly having devastating consequences for patients and families. So the question we must ask ourselves is this: do we as a society truly value the care that hospices provide? And if the answer is yes, we must reflect that value in our policies and funding structures. And this means increasing NHS funding for hospices so they're not forced to depend so heavily on charity. And it means streamlining the processes of accessing funds through ICBs with clear timelines and accountability. And it means recognising the unique challenges faced by children's hospices and providing them with the additional support they need. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, hospices like North London Hospice and Noah's Ark Children's Hospice exemplify the best of what we can achieve to society. They are places of compassion, expertise and hope, but they cannot continue to operate under the current financial bureaucratic pressures. We owe it to them and to the people they serve to provide the support they need to thrive. Let us ensure that hospices have the resources that they need to continue their vital work, not just today, but for generations to come.
Thank you. To get everybody in, there will be a hard stop at 4 minutes, and that will may reduce even further. I call Saoirse Eastwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for bringing this matter to the House, and I also want to pay tribute, because we've all talked about it so much, most of us today, to the Honourable Member for Spen Valley with the way in which he's conducted the debate around assisted dying. I want to mention that because regardless of people's opinions on that matter, what everyone agreed was that we needed to discuss palliative care and make sure that that was delivered in a way that was equitable, not just in terms of locally here, but in a way that reflected what a lot of other members have touched on, and that it isn't necessarily just about hospices, but it's about the palliation part as well. I don't actually have a hospice in my constituency of Lagan Valley, but I do have various constituents that would make use of the Southern Area Hospice and indeed the Mary Curie Hospice. And as well as that, we also have the wonderful Daisy Lodge, which is a facility that is used sometimes for hospice, but also that means people going to get respite. This is about supporting people to live well. And I think it was the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green during the assisted dying debate that talked about, in order before we die, we have to live well. And I think that should really be at the forefront of what we're talking about today whenever we're really capturing that spirit of how do we help people live the lives that they should be living in a way that isn't impacted by equality through a loss of services. One of the issues that was also mentioned on that day was the issue of cancer, something I know very well because my husband has cancer, but something I want to make clear is that most people want to be able to die at home. And for some, that is something that is very achievable and very doable. However, for many people who suffer from blood cancer, we know that haematological neoplasms often prohibit people being able to die at home. We've also heard from the Honourable Member from Farnham and Boredom, if I remember right, if that's the proper name, the issues to do with workforce. Sometimes we see in cancer that there is a real onus upon people who are haematologists, and that's because so much of it is to do with the bloods and how they are performing in terms of the chemotherapy, radiotherapy or otherwise. And one of the real concerns that I have is in the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee in 2019, they raised the issue of workforce of the Haematological Society, RC College of Path, and that was something that was really concerning to me at the time. I'm not sure we're very much further on in that, and that is something that really concerns me still to this day. I'm also very concerned about the impact of the National Insurance contribution. Indeed, I was the only Northern Irish MP to make an amendment to that bill to make sure that we could try and exclude Northern Ireland from that. Unfortunately, that wasn't successful. But I do think it further creates a divide between those people that are community and voluntary providers and those people that are state statutory services, which isn't fair. Hear, hear. I also think that it's incumbent on all of us today to keep talking about dying well. We have a good Irish tradition of wakes, and we really get into the spirit of helping people through that real loss and bereavement and grief. And I think we can only continue to do that if we do have a strong, well-funded hospice. Yes, I will indeed give way.
I'm very grateful, Madam Speaker, to my honourable friend from Lagan Valley. I was in her constituency yesterday, so I know well the points that she is making, and thanks for letting me visit. But I wonder, as she talks about dying well, whether she'll join me in paying tribute to the Douglas Macmillan Hospice actually in Stoke-on-Trent South, in my honourable friend's constituency, that does so much to provide care and compassion to many people in Newcastle-under-Lyme and across North Staffordshire as they seek to ensure that people do indeed die well.
Yes, I thank the member for Newcastle-under-Lyme for his contribution, and indeed, of course, I'll join with him in that. But I suppose in closing, what I want us to do is keep talking about living and dying well, because we can't shy away from this debate, regardless of people's opinion on it. We owe it to our constituents, not just in Lagan Valley, but right across the UK, to make sure that we do indeed get this right. Thank you.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In this Parliament, we have spoken at length about the importance of valuing dignity at the end of life, and that principle must be applied to hospice and palliative care, which has faced uncertain funding and been too hard to access for too long. Now, like most of us, I have reason to be grateful for the work of palliative care professionals, and even though more than 15 years have now passed, I still remember with that great sense of gratitude and relief the compassionate care that my grandmother, Janet Russell, received at the end of her life at the St Mary's Hospice, which is now the Birmingham Hospice in Selly Oak. And in advance of this debate, I've been contacted by palliative care professionals in my constituency who have stressed the consequences of those long-term pressures that we have heard so much about tonight. The shortages of palliative care workers and the strain that this puts on those who remain. As one said, I'm deeply passionate about what I do, and I've seen many lives improved by palliative care, but I'm exhausted and often think about giving up. The strains on the system have led to, and I quote again from one of my constituents, a higher threshold for admitting patients and a lower threshold for discharging patients. We are being asked to stretch further with less for longer. You can't give quality medical care when your hands are empty. And they have stressed too that there can be public misunderstandings about the nature of palliative care, which reduces suffering and in fact on average extends life. But those misconceptions have, I have to say, in some cases been exacerbated by some of the media coverage of the assisted dying debate, which can make people less likely to seek that care. Now, A number of honourable members have spoken about the importance of children's hospice funding, and that children's hospice grant was effectively ended last year, although it is important to note that transitional arrangements were put in place. So the new funding announced before Christmas has been welcomed by the sector, and it's important to stress tonight how welcome that funding is. I heard that recently at the Acorns Children's Hospice, which in the last year has cared for 14 children from Northfield, and we've heard too about the plans that they have to put that funding to good use. When I visited recently alongside my constituency neighbour, the Honourable Member for Selly Oak, it is an exceptional facility. But the sector still does need long-term funding certainty set out on a multi-year basis if they are to deliver efficiencies and certainty for staff. And I would like to ask ministers, and I welcome the constructive approach that the Minister has taken since July on this issue, to give us an update today or soon on whether they will be in a position to either restore the Children's Hospice grant on a long-term basis or provide similar certainty through another means. And whatever happens in this Parliament in respect of assisted dying, will they work with palliative care professionals to set out, as part of the NHS 10-year plan, a clear timeline for improving palliative care provision, which in too many areas is strained? I'd like to just finish by thanking the Backbench Business Debate Committee for making time for this important discussion, and to thank the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for the bringing of this debate and for the constructive tone in which it has been made.
We have 19 speakers and 60 minutes. I'm going to have to drop it down to 3 minutes. 3 minutes, and the next speaker is Angus MacDonald. Late.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I shall be as fast as I can. There is no doubt that there is massive support for the hospice movement in this place. And whilst the new funding is welcome, I want to say the words from Claire Galley, the Chief Executive of the Lewis Manning Hospice in Poole, who said there is simply no point having fully fitted, beautiful buildings if we cannot afford the staff to run them. Now, we know that when someone has a terminal diagnosis, their world turns upside down. That it may have come out of the blue, it may be after many years of awful treatment, already at breaking point and sick. They have to come to terms with losing the person they love, but also learning to cope with managing distressing symptoms, processing their own emotions, managing the money worries, and potentially their own health issues. There'll be people coming in and out of the house at a time when they just want to be left alone, but they'll also be terrified of being left alone and something awful happening. They're more likely to call their GP on a Friday afternoon, worried there's no one around at the weekend. More likely to witness a distressing symptom and ring for an ambulance, creating an emergency dash to the hospital and a lengthy stay on a trolley. More likely to be subjected to blood tests and interventions that will not alter the path of their disease. I went on that journey when my mum, Lynn Foster, died of ovarian cancer, aged just 59. But we were lucky. We had the support of district nurses and palliative care teams through Forest Home. And through the last 8 weeks of her life, when she didn't leave her bed, those people came in and out of her house with no need to knock. We knew where the kettle was, and they knew when we needed our own time. They managed every need, including supporting her as she planned her own funeral. But she didn't want to go to hospital. She wanted to end her days in the thatched cottage that had been her lifelong dream. Just like, as most people say, that they want. But only 37% of cancer patients are at home at the time of their death. Junior doctors tell us that palliative patients are spending months in general medical wards, frequently dying there. And I was told it is not right, it is not humane. General wards lack the skill, and it is not saving the NHS money. I have written to the Minister about the Lewis Manning anticipatory care model, which I also raised at the all-party parliamentary group for End-of-Life Care. And their programme seeks involvement at the point of diagnosis. They ran a pilot from April 24 to January this year, which saved NHS Dorset £765,000 across Poole and Purbeck.
Will she give way?
Yes, of course.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and may I also extend my gratitude to the member for Spen Valley. Her terminally ill adults bill has done so much to bring this debate into the national consciousness. Does the member agree with me and the Liberal Democrats that the government should exempt hospices from the government NIC's rise?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and I completely agree. But what is really ridiculous is, did you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that according to the Department of Health and Social Care, over 10 million hospital days followed an emergency admission in the last year of life, and 10% of people who died of cancer had 3 or more emergency admissions in the last 3 months of their life. The anticipatory care model can prevent some of these. It can reduce that trauma, and I urge him to take my letter that was sent in November last year and arrange to meet myself and Claire Galley so we can talk about the transformative approach. But in ending, I just must tell you how deeply concerned I am that in Dorset I've had an email from Marie Curie telling me that Dorset ICB is going to stop commissioning specialist end-of-life care from March. The rationale being that the personal care commissioning will go via council frameworks, but they do not require expertise in the provision of end-of-life care, and I would urge the Minister to insist that this framework does actually listen to the specialists and ensure that people like Marie Curie and Lewis Manning are heard. They are looking to make redundancies and close services at a time our hospital beds are at a premium.
Order. Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hartlepool is incredibly lucky to be served by an amazing institution, one that I know has touched the lives of so many in our town. Alice House Hospice and the brilliant people who work there, like hospitals across the country, provide essential support to those in their final stages of life, ensuring they receive the dignity and care they deserve. The stark reality, though, is that Alice House alone requires £3.6 million each year to operate, with only 25% of that money coming from government. That means they have to raise £7,000 a day just to keep the doors open and provide services. Any additional work beyond ordinary maintenance comes at an extra cost. And as we've heard today, this is a situation mirrored across the country. Dignity at the end of life should not rely on charity. Rising costs and inconsistent financial support have left many hospitals struggling, forced them to cut back their services. Indeed, Hospice UK reports that as many as 20% of hospices were cutting some level of provision, fueling a bed crisis. Sadly, this was the case for Alice House when they closed their long-term care unit in 2023. I welcome the Labour government's recognition of this financial crisis and their backing of it with the £126 million that was announced in December. And while that support is welcomed, we can't be complacent. We need to ensure that the 10-year NHS plan includes long-term commitments to reforming the hospice funding model. This is essential, not just to prevent another funding crisis, but to ensure that hospices can provide the essential care on which our communities rely. The need for palliative care is projected to increase by 25% over the next 25 years. We must therefore act now to ensure that our hospices can meet demand. They are not just places of care. They are vital support systems that relieve pressure on our NHS, providing specialised care and training to health professionals across the board. When hospices are forced to cut services, the need for care does not disappear. It shifts directly onto our already overburdened NHS. Now, life has a tendency to shape and focus one's attention on the issues in this place. My father has Alzheimer's, and although he's currently very well, I know that our family, me and him and my wonderful mother, are going to face a difficult future. We have a responsibility now to fix that future for everybody who will need that care in the future, and I hope that's what the government are going to do. Thank you.
Shannon.
To speak in this debate, and also to follow the honourable member for Hartlepool and thank him for his personal story. Personal stories tell the story of the debate that we have in front of us. During the last debate on assisted dying, the dire straits of our palliative care system was under the spotlight, and rightly so. So I am pleased to see this debate today and to address the system and the lack of funding to that system. I want to refer to two charities in Northern Ireland which I've had contact with, and one of them is Northern Ireland Hospice. They've highlighted that government funds approximately 30% of service costs, so that the majority of Northern Ireland Hospice income relies on the goodwill and the generosity of voluntary donations and other fundraising activities. That means that 70% of the funding to provide a specialist palliative care for over 4,000 infants, children and adults with life-limiting conditions in Northern Ireland comes from the funding raised by volunteers. We owe a lot to Northern Ireland Hospice and their volunteers. When we take into account the cost of living crisis and the fact that this naturally is just what people are able to give and it's a fact of life, although the people of Northern Ireland are incredibly generous when it comes to charity giving, we can see the concerns of the hospice sector. Indeed, last year when the Northern Ireland Hospice believed that their funding would be cut by the Health Trust in Northern Ireland, they made an announcement to say that they would have to cut the beds available in the Children's Hospice. The service said it might reduce capacity from 7 beds week round to 6 beds Monday to Friday and only 3 at the weekend. A massive change to what they're able to do. This is not the news that we would like to hear. It doesn't mean, of course, that less children are in need of hospice facilities because they are well. This is because the costs have risen and the ability of fundraisers has decreased, and government have not enabled Health Trust to make up the difference. Whilst I've highlighted the Children's Hospital today, the issue is replicated in adult care in every corner of this UK. Can just, for the record, and I want to put it on the record, the Honourable Member for Northampton was here. He was a Health Minister in Northern Ireland. Whenever the Northern Ireland Hospice needed some help, he, as the Minister, was able to allocate some funding to get them over that hard patch. So for the record, I thank him for all that he has done to make it happen. Funding for palliative care is simply not sufficient. I referred earlier to the burnout and the Honourable Member for Wimbledon very kindly let me intervene. Medical staff whose loyalty and passion for the job keeps them in post doing overtime or unpaid, staying on to provide cover, and yet this means that they are exhausted and not able to carry on. Marie Curry, I've also said that 1 in 4 people will die without the right care and support, and far too many people are dying in avoidable pain, in poverty and alone. By 2048, the need for end-of-life care will rise by up to 25% compared to today. So the challenge for tomorrow is even greater than the challenge for today. Over 730,000 people will need care every year. We know that this crisis is looming, and now is the time to make the changes for our loved ones and for our constituents. And that is what I'm asking the Minister for, as everyone else is in this House as well. Thank you.
Brian Leishman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for bringing this debate this evening. Regardless of the rosette, I will challenge any politician when they say that the NHS is broken. It's not broken. It's just underfunded. And the NHS is starved of the resources it needs to function to its very best. And Madam Deputy Speaker, on these benches, we are enormously proud of the NHS and its founding principles. The right to free at the point of use healthcare, universal and comprehensive. Because money should never be the passport to the very best treatment. People should get the best that modern science can offer. It's our greatest creation and it's socialism in action. And as the NHS endures another hard winter, so must Labour's founding principles also endure. Because for the NHS, the solution shouldn't always be the private sector. The private sector receiving an extra £2.5 billion a year in government funding to cut waiting lists is not one of the principles of either the NHS or the Labour Party. And in the earlier back and forth between honourable members of how to find money, it doesn't necessarily have to mean cuts. I'll suggest an annual wealth tax. Madam Deputy Speaker, in Scotland our hospices remain under enormous strain. Annually, approximately 21,000 adults and children receive expert palliative, end-of-life care and bereavement support. The heads of all 14 hospice charities in Scotland have said that their sector is in the grip of an insurmountable funding gap, and staff have openly spoken of the dire possibility of budget shortfalls reaching the point where there will be no other option but to introduce service reductions. And of course, staff will do everything in their power to avoid that happening. But that is the stark reality of where palliative end-of-life care is in Scotland. The hospice sector needs the Scottish Government to provide further financial support to address the shortfall in statutory funding not keeping up with increased costs. This, coupled with the Scottish Government needing to deliver on its promise of a new national funding framework for hospice care, is desperately needed so hospices can prepare for the long term.
On that point, will the member give way?
I will.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree with me that the Secretary of State for Health repeatedly tells us that all roads lead to Westminster when it comes to funding? So would he agree with me that the Scottish Government is only able to do what it can with the resources made available by Westminster?
Thanks very much to the honourable member. I would say that the Scottish Government need to do much better with the resources that they've been given. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, further on the topic of funding, hospices also rely on financial donations. People, the length and breadth of the UK, raise so much for hospices. And naturally, many loyal supporters of the hospice sector have not been immune to the bankrupt political ideology of austerity, and then the following cost of living crisis that has seen ordinary people become poorer. Out of control energy bills, escalating food costs, sky-high mortgages and rents, and overall, the general erosion of living standards means donations are an expenditure many people can simply no longer afford. The rebuilding of wider society cannot happen without the rebuilding and investment in the vital public services people rely on, and that includes a properly funded and resourced health and social care system which has the same principles and ethos as it had when Labour created it.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I won't focus on assisted dying, assisted suicide this evening, because as the member for Wimbledon said in a very good opening speech, we are all united in this place in our desire to see improvements in the palliative care system. But I do feel compelled to make this simple point of fact, which is that in studies research shows that in jurisdictions and countries around the world which have introduced an assisted dying and assisted suicide law, the investment in the quality of palliative care declines relative to those countries which haven't got an assisted dying, assisted suicide law, and that's for reasons which are fairly comprehensible. It is a fact. So I surely, Madam Deputy Speaker, I implore the House we should fix our palliative care system before we consider opening up a law on assisted dying. Now, the United Kingdom is, of course, the birthplace of the hospice movement, and we have some of the best palliative care services and specialists in the world here. But as we've heard this evening, the fact is that our system simply isn't working. We have demand for palliative care, for hospice services, on a scale that was never anticipated in the post-war years when the NHS was developed. And of course the challenges of growing demand have been sadly exacerbated by decisions that the government has made, as we've heard this evening. And I'll quickly mention the two.
On that point,
happy to give way.
I went to St Barnabas Hospice in Lincoln on Friday, our local hospice. They do wonderful work. I talked to the CEO. He's literally tearing his hair out because of this NI increase, he's losing £300,000 a year. He pays his nurses less, he has to, than the local hospital. He's literally funding the NHS and cutting his own service in the hospice. I beg the government to sink again on this NI increase on hospices.
My right honourable friend makes absolutely the right point, and it's one echoed by the experience of hospices across the country. And the Prospect House, which is on the edge of Swindon in my constituency, in East Wiltshire, only receives 23% of its funding from the taxpayer. They faced a significant deficit this year. They took immense pains and steps to meet this funding shortfall. A huge response from a public fundraising appeal raised them over £170,000 from the local community. That was before the budget. The effect of the national insurance increase alone on Prospect House is £170,000. So the entire generosity of the public has been swiped away by the Chancellor and put Prospect House back exactly where it was. A similar experience by Julia's House in Devizes, a children's hospice, the most wonderful place, the most moving place I've visited in my time as an MP. They only get 8% of their budget from the taxpayer, and their deficit has gone up from £900,000 before the budget to 1.1 million now. So we desperately need a comprehensive review of palliative care, and I want to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady, the member for York Central, and also the noble Lady Baroness Finlay in the other place, who are leading a review of palliative care, with a review to coming forward very soon with recommendations for the government on how to improve the system. And indeed, thanks to Lady Finlay's amendment to the Health and Social Care Act that the last government passed, ICBs are now required to commission palliative care as part of their obligations. Unfortunately, no money was attached to that amendment to the bill. And as we've heard tonight, the way that different ICBs commission care is not good enough. For instance, I regret that the local ICB in our area won't commission Juliet House, the children's hospice I mentioned. So we do need a better commissioning model. And I want to just take issue with the point made by the Honourable Lady for Birmingham Erdington, who suggested that the ICBs can't find money within their budgets to do this. I actually think that if the ICBs did their job properly, commissioning services locally, they should be able to move budgets around, because the fact is that if you invest properly in palliative care, you save money elsewhere in the NHS. This is a crucial point. You reduce expensive bed stays in hospital, and you reduce the demand on ambulances and other services. So it should be possible, I think, to improve palliative care within the envelope that ICBs currently have. We do not want a system of enforced uniformity, not a great new national bureaucracy. I'm concerned that some members have been suggesting we sort of nationalise the system. I don't think that's right. We need to ensure that the ICBs can do the job that they need to, and that hospices themselves can innovate in the way that they want to. Thank you.
Serena Brackenridge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The crisis in funding, the postcode lottery and health inequalities faced by many families, particularly in accessing hospice and palliative care, weighed heavily on my decision in the assisted dying bill. This is why I am sincerely grateful to the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for securing this very important debate. I was profoundly moved by the extraordinary work of our local hospice, Compton Care, when I recently visited their new hub in the Scotland's Low Hill just before Christmas. Deeply moved by the work that they do to support families who turn to them at their darkest of times. I saw outstanding medical care provided by specialist medical teams and counsellors, but also the wraparound support that they provide, from creative therapies, grief counselling, bespoke support for bereaved children, to those quiet, crucial moments where their specialist staff know just what to say when things are so difficult for families and unimaginable to navigate. This is why the government's extra £100 million for hospices across the country, alongside an extra £26 million for children's hospice services, are also essential. The biggest investment in a generation, which is a clear sign of the commitment that this government has for all to have access to high-quality end-of-life care. This will result in hospices like Compton Care to reach more people, especially in communities that have long felt the brunt of deepening health inequalities. Much welcome support for families across Wolverhampton and Willenhall, ensuring that no one faces end of life without the care, comfort and compassion that they deserve. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the government's investment boost in hospice and palliative care, but I will continue to advocate for equity in care and never lose sight of constituents' fundamental right that dignity in care matters right until the very end. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to start by thanking the compassionate, dedicated and caring hospice staff and volunteers. Year-round, they support patients and their families through some of the most difficult moments of their lives. I welcome that this debate will highlight the need for greater, more consistent government support, which will enable their work delivering this vital care. Most pressingly, we must ensure fiscal policies do not negatively impact our hospices. Because hospices are pillars of our healthcare system. They support over 300,000 people annually and provide not just outstanding clinical care, but emotional and psychological support. I've seen firsthand the many ways hospices work to bring some sense of comfort and normality to a very distressing time, from group activities and special events to creating quiet spaces for reflection. Hospices are not just care providers, they're vital partners in the healthcare system, reducing pressure on NHS services by offering specialist inpatient care and community-based services. Hospices prevent unnecessary A&E visits and facilitate timely hospital discharges. When hospices are forced to cut services, the burden on the NHS only grows, making long-term support for hospices not just compassionate, but practical. One of my constituents recently contacted me to tell me about her husband's experience. Unfortunately, there was no room for her husband at my constituency's local hospice, the Princess Alice Hospice. My constituent strongly believes that her husband's end-of-life experience would have been more peaceful and less painful had he been admitted to this hospice. Instead, he was left at home in extreme pain for hours. The community nurses eventually did come to administer pain relief, shortly after which he passed away. But my constituent has expressed that the whole experience was deeply traumatic for her and her children, and she urged me to call for more funding so other families can be spared from living through such distress.
Hear, hear.
Despite their crucial role, the hospice sector is at breaking point, and as a fundraiser, I work closely with hospices and I know just how precarious their financial situation is. Many people do not realise how little of hospice care is funded by the government. On average, the government only funds 1/3, the remaining is reliant on charitable donations. This imbalance leaves hospitals vulnerable to financial crises as rising costs and inconsistent donations fail to bridge the gap. This funding model does not work. 1 in 5 UK hospices has had to cut services in the last year or were planning to do so due to insufficient funding, and this trend will continue unless action is taken. Although I welcome the government's £126 million package for hospices, we must see it for what it is, a stopgap, not a long-term solution. We need a plan to put hospices on a sustainable, fair and consistent financial footing. A long-term reform of hospice funding is needed as part of the NHS's 10-year plan. Hospices, like shooting stars and Princess Alice, embody the value of compassion and community. They provide comfort where there is pain, hope where there is despair and dignity where there is loss. It's our responsibility to ensure they can continue this vital work. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Wimbledon and also the Backbench Business Committee for enabling this important debate today. This morning I visited Myton Hospice's Rugby Myton Support Hub, which together with their 2 inpatient centres and teams providing many distinct services give valued care to my constituents in Rugby. I want to put on record my sincere gratitude to all of the staff and volunteers. The team this morning briefed me on the services they provide at the hub, and I'll briefly touch on them, Madam Deputy Speaker. So they provide coffee mornings, counselling for patients and families, opportunities to enjoy arts and craft and hear music, physical exercise sessions, self-care advice, support for carers and much more. All are delivered with kindness, all are supported by an amazing array of volunteers, and this is all backed by incredible fundraisers, including former Mayor of Rugby councillor Maggie O'Rourke, for whom Myton was her mayoral charity recently. Communities often rise to the challenge of fundraising and recently helped Myton secure £240,000 to recruit, train and pay 5 registered nurses so that more people in Coventry and Warwickshire can access a hospice bed. I hope the Minister will consider 3 points that arise from my visit. Firstly, volunteers and goodwill are of course wonderful, but can only go so far, and so any additional long-term funding from the local ICB or central government can go a very long way, particularly given how with the charitable nature of hospices there can be a multiplier effect. Secondly, dispelling myths. Today I saw that hospices are not just about those last few weeks or days at the end of life. They're about support in a huge range of ways to help people with life-limiting conditions to live better until the very end of their life. Further, they're there to support families, and that hospices wish to engage with people much earlier in their illnesses. And thirdly, on communications, I hope the Minister will consider that despite the best efforts of organisations like Myton Hospice, many people do not understand what hospices are, what services they provide, that they're free or that they're not private providers in the traditional sense. So what more can the government do to help hospices educate the public about their services, particularly now that there's more of a spotlight on palliative care given the vote recently on my honourable friend for Spen Valley's bill. Thank you.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hospices in Devon were already struggling before the government's budget last autumn.
that introduced a hike in national insurance on employers. So to talk about firstly the national picture, we've heard that a third of funding for hospices tends to be received by the state, by the NHS, but in Devon that is less than 1/5. For Hospice Care, a charity based in Exeter, the figure is 18%. For Seaton Hospice at Home and for Sidmouth Hospice at Home, that figure is 0%. They don't receive any funding at all from NHS Devon. And last year I got together with Ben Bradshaw and Simon Jupp, the former MPs for Exeter and for East Devon, and we put aside our political differences. Simon Jupp and I were fighting for the seat of Honiton and Sidmouth at the time, but we put that aside, wrote to the chair of NHS Devon, the brilliant Sarah Wollaston, and secured an extra £500,000 for hospice care in Devon. But nonetheless, that charity is now still short of a £2.5 million deficit per year. Following the national insurance announcement last autumn, The Guardian reported in mid-November that Whitehall was considering some options to relieve the financial pressure on hospices and suggested that civil servants were weighing up the possibilities of offsetting the NI rise, funding hospice nursing staff directly, or setting up, quote, a direct funding pot for hospices. It seems, following the announcement on the 19th of December, the Christmas gift of capital funding for hospices, that the government chose the direct funding pot for hospices. The problem with this additional capital funding is that a lot of hospices don't have physical buildings. They don't have infrastructure. They provide nursing services and hospice at home. So they can't simply offset the day-to-day spending with that capital spending. They are completely missing out. And this is the experience for Seaton Hospice at Home and Sidmouth Hospice Home services in my the constituency in East Devon. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, these charities step in where the NHS does not. Providing care is absolutely central to the government's vision of shifting treatment from hospitals to communities, and yet the current trajectory seems to be forcing patients back into overstretched acute hospitals. Thank you.
Dixon.
Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for securing this debate and for his excellent and moving speech to open it. Hospices across the country care for hundreds of thousands of people living with conditions that limit their lives or face their lives coming to an end. And I want to take this opportunity to put on record my thanks to two of the hospices that provide crucial services for people living across my Dartford constituency. Firstly, Eleanor, a specialist palliative care provider for adults and children based in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Gravesham. Since 1985, Eleanor has been providing hospice care for those who need it the most and has recently opened a new wellbeing centre that is a hugely welcome addition to their facilities. I also want to pay tribute to Demelza, who have children's hospices in the constituencies of the honourable members for Sittingbourne and Sheppey and Eltham and Chislehurst. Demelza supports families going through what I can only imagine are some of the most difficult circumstances that I can possibly think of, where children are facing serious or life-limiting conditions. Given the importance of these services, and I can understand the high degree of concern from the sector before the government's announcement of further funding last month, with the NHS England Children's Hospice Grant at that point not having been confirmed for 2024-25. I therefore join honourable members who have welcomed the 19th of December announcement by the Health and Social Care Secretary of £100 million in funding improvements for hospices, such as updated IT and improved facilities for patients and visitors. I also very much welcome the news that hospices for children and young people will also receive £26 million in revenue funding for the next financial year. Hospice UK has welcomed this funding, saying it will bring clarity to critically important services for children with life-limiting illnesses. And you're welcome to, yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much for allowing me to intervene. Can I ask the the honourable member what he thinks about the many hospices that actually don't need the capital, they're just desperate for the income. Because I know for the sounds that that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. I'm interested in your answer.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, for his question. Certainly the capital funding will be of immense help to a wide variety of hospices in making sure effectively they can upgrade their operations so they're less reliant on both revenue funding from the charity sector but also from the NHS. But clearly we need a sustainable funding model. I know the Minister will come back on that at the end of this debate. So let's wish, finally, Hospice UK, individual hospices and our NHS every success with their amazing care for all who need their services, and hope that they will be able to find a sustainable financial future as a result of the government's work. Thank you, Madam.
Deputy Speaker, and I begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Wimbledon, for bringing forward this incredibly important debate. Anyone who's been paying attention to my contributions in this place will not be surprised that I am once again raising my deepest possible concerns about St Raphael's Hospice in my constituency. Their case is emblematic of the problems across this undervalued and dramatically important sector. One of my first visits after being elected as the MP in July was to St Raph's Hospice, where I saw the incredible care that they offer residents in my constituency and beyond. I've met several times with them since then, including just this morning, and it's clear to me that whilst the Secretary of State's £100 million announcement is welcome, it does simply not go far enough. The funding is restricted to capital expenditure for actions like refurbishments and digital services. Whilst undoubtedly important to modernise and update the capability of our hospices, the funding does not address their immediate financial hardship, especially in the context of the Chancellor's budget. St Raph's is set to face an estimated £140,000 increase in staff costs this coming year due to the rise in employer national insurance contributions. This burden only adds to the significant strain on the hospice, which is currently funded by the NHS for just 28% of its budget, and therefore reliant on the generosity of charitable donations for the remainder. If the government fails to see sense and exempt hospices from this hike, structural deficits will only continue to grow in the sector, pushing many over the cliff edge altogether and forcing those who remain open to cut their services to the bone. While the announcement for additional funding is appreciated, it does not address the root of the problem. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government's approach is dangerously akin to tackling a leaking roof with a mop and a bucket. The Secretary of State spoke last week about the need to shift the focus of healthcare from the hospital to the community, yet I fear their treatment of the hospice sector has done exactly the opposite. Due to the limited funding St Raph's receives, the hospice has been forced to cut its Hospice at Home scheme, a vital service where staff directly attend to patients in their own homes in the local community. I think the government front bench agrees that the kind of community-based palliative care that they are hoping for with the Hospice at Home scheme, which is further being cut due to their actions. These sorts of issues show why they must bring forward a long-term funding arrangement for hospices if they intend to keep their promise. My Hospices and Healthcare report on funding bill, presented last year and due for a second reading in July, would set out ways for the government to consider those options to deliver a long-term funding deal. I sincerely hope, however, that by July the government will have listened and the bill won't need to be debated at all. So I urge the government, please make my bill completely redundant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and indeed to the honourable member for Wimbledon for securing this debate. Like many members here this evening, I'm here to talk about my local hospice, just over the constituency border in Whittington. St Giles Hospice has been doing its vital work for more than 40 years. However, 2024 was a very challenging year for the hospice. Rising costs plus the impact of the cost of living crisis making fundraising more difficult, unfortunately led them to make some impossibly hard decisions last summer. St Giles had to close one of its wings and make a number of redundancies amongst its clinical staff, and that is not due to reduced need across Lichfield, Burntwood, the surrounding villages and further afield, but was due only to the financial situation that they faced. At this point, I would like to commend my constituent Sean Collins, who is leading St Giles's urgent funding appeal. St Giles supported Sean and his children following the loss of their wife and mother, Felicity, at just 38 years old. I'm not sure that I would be strong enough to turn that tragedy into something as positive as Sean has done, but he has all of my support as he does so. The generous donors to St Giles do so much to care for people that they have never met with their donations. In a recent meeting that I had with Eleanor Eustace, the CEO of the hospice, she mentioned how much she values all that they do, but actually that she doesn't want to have a fully funded model because of the value that that fundraising brings to the entire community around the hospice. Having said that, though, government support is essential to make sure that hospices across the country can continue to do everything that they do for all of our communities. So I really welcome the additional £100 million of funding that the government announced just before Christmas, but we really must find ways to ensure that all hospices remain sustainable in the long term. St Giles receives just 18% of its funding from the NHS, less than £1 in 5 when the national average is £1 in 3. Levelling that playing field cannot come fast enough. In addition to this, St Giles has to deal with 5 different integrated care boards. That's 5 different NHS organisations for 5 different geographies, all with different funding formulae, different grant processes, different reporting mechanisms, different key performance indicators, different timescales, all for grants that adds up to nothing more than an administrative nightmare. Simplifying and standardising that process will ensure that St Giles can spend less time securing grants from the NHS and more time on caring for the community in my constituency and further afield. And I would ask the Minister that he looks very, very, very closely at that point, because there is a real opportunity there to secure a significant benefit for hospices across the country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for bringing this very important motion to the House tonight. But I think, while I congratulate him, it is unfortunate that it wasn't done in government time, because when we did debate assisted dying, it was an issue that was raised on a number of occasions in here. But Madam Deputy Speaker, it has realised, and I think realises the importance of the discussion around palliative care, because the All Ireland Institute of Hospice and Palliative Care, in a recent commissioned study of 500 people in Northern Ireland, actually indicated that still more than 1 in 3 people would think that they only have days to live if their doctor or healthcare professional talked to them about palliative care, and more than 1 in 4 would feel their doctor was actually given up on them if they talked about referring them to palliative care. So I think this debate today and the previous debates we've had, I think raises the importance of these discussions that we actually have with family and with wider community in regards to even the work that has been done in Northern Ireland in regards to those conversations around advanced care planning, where families, health professionals and all parts of the society are actually involved in those open conversations. Madam Deputy Speaker, much has been said about the fundraising model around hospices and palliative care providers, and in Northern Ireland they're no different, and we talk here about the necessity of a funding model. Madam Deputy Speaker, when the Department of Health and the entire health service in Northern Ireland has been relying on year budgets since 2016, not only does it put a stress on our National Health Service, but it also puts a stress and a strain on those other providers, or palliative care providers, or hospices, or GPs and our community pharmacies. So a desire, I think, coming from Northern Ireland, coming from the rest of health and social care, would be to see that recurrent guaranteed budget that we could make those transformation decisions actually based on. But in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to pay tribute to the hospices and palliative care providers that we have in Northern Ireland, but especially the people who work in them. Much has been said here today in regards to funding care models, how they're managed and all the rest of it, but we often forget that at the heart of every care package, every delivery, every door that's opened, every door that's knocked, every cup of tea that is made for someone in one of those conditions, it's actually those healthcare professionals who have that strength, that ability, actually to move on to the next patient, move on to the next family, actually to give them that same level of dedicated professional support. And Madam Deputy Speaker, in finishing, I want to pay tribute to some of the staff in the Macmillan unit in Nottingham Area Hospital and the Specialist Palliative Care unit. I had the honour and privilege of visiting them many times as Health Minister in Northern Ireland, but more especially when they were providing support and care to Shirley Smith almost this time last year. A fantastic supporter, grandmother of one of my councillors and a fantastic lady, but I want to pay tribute to them.
Phil Brickell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to join colleagues in congratulating the member for Wimbledon on securing this important debate. Madam Deputy Speaker, Bolton Hospice has been facing a funding gap of £1.2 million, which could have meant cutting as many as a third of its beds. And we should remind ourselves what each bed and every penny lost actually means. In many cases, the real-life impact of these numbers is the prolonged suffering of the most unimaginable kind for the individual and the heart-rending experience of having to witness this for family and friends. Let us not forget that 300,000 people depend on hospices every year. Bolton Hospice, in part following a fantastic campaign from the Bolton News newspaper and the huge generosity of the people of Bolton, was able to cut its deficit to £400,000, still a very large amount. And I did my level best to contribute to that campaign by traipsing up Mount Kilimanjaro. But frankly, hospices are so important to so many people that they shouldn't have to rely on the kindness of strangers. That's why I was pleased to learn just before Christmas that Bolton Hospice is in line to receive a slice of the once-in-a-generation £100 million national funding boost announced by the Health Secretary. Such investment pays for itself in many ways, for example, by supporting the government's plan to shift more care into the community and keep people out of hospital who need not be there, and by ensuring, importantly, that they can die in their place of choice with the care that they need. However, inevitably, more funding will be required as we cope with an ageing population with increasingly complex care needs. And given the pressures on public finances and the cost of living crisis, we must look for creative and innovative solutions. And with that in mind, I would like to raise the work of my constituents, Corinne and Tricia Dolby, who through tireless campaigning have secured the support of 30 hospices, 36,000 petition signatures and over 100 parliamentarians in raising the profile of hospices' financial pressures with a petition presented to number 10 Downing Street last month. Corinne and Tricia's petition calls government to redirect the first £100 million of fines levied by the Financial Conduct Authority on banks and other financial services firms to be redirected to the hospice sector. And since April 2012, the money collected from FCA fines has gone to the Treasury, which is then able to go towards charitable donations. Now, we will need to think carefully about how we make sure that hospices are put on the sustainable funding platform that they so desperately need. But I would urge my colleagues, including the Minister, to carefully consider this proposal. Finally, it would be remiss of me not to mention my friend, the member for Spen Valley's Private Members Bill on assisted dying. Palliative care provides relief so urgently needed for hundreds of thousands of people around the country and their families, and we absolutely must be making sure it is the best it possibly can be.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to begin, like other colleagues, by paying tribute to our hospices, to everyone who works and indeed volunteers in palliative and end-of-life care, providing such amazing support to patients and to their loved ones at that most difficult time of life, i.e. Death, and helping people to have a good death, as many people have spoken about today. The importance of that is so crucial. Particularly like to mention St Michael's Hospice, Hereford, in my constituency. It's a place I've had an association with for many, many years. They've provided amazing care to friends of mine who have died there, and you know, they're just so well loved in the community. But isn't it such a shame, as so many colleagues have said today here, that palliative care is so dependent on charitable funding? As the member for Huddersfield said, you know, it's integral to our healthcare system, except it isn't, because it isn't fully funded by our healthcare system. It's not actually free at the point of need, except thanks to the grace of the kindness of strangers and charitable funding. And while members on the opposite benches have made mention many times this evening of the £100 million capital injection from the government, absolutely it is welcome. One might think that it was so frequently mentioned, perhaps the whips encouraged the gentle mentioning of that on behalf of other members. But the problem is that that is a short-term capital injection when what is needed is a long-term revenue funding solution. Now, revenue budgets in hospices are under extreme pressure despite the amazing efforts of fundraisers, and indeed it's been made worse. St Michael's has a £240,000 additional bill next year just because of the rise in employer national insurance contributions. This is a problem. The current funding model for hospice care is a problem. Now, it's good that there's now statutory requirement for ICBs to fund palliative care, but there is complete lack of parity across the country. Hospices have to negotiate individually with ICBs all across the country, individually every year. And a hospice leader said to me today, you know, we have no sight of the future. In fact, another hospice leader said, you know, when I'm considering redundancies, it's no use telling people that I'm going to be resurfacing the car park with the new capital funding. We have to have a sustainable revenue funding solution, a clear, fair, long-term funding solution for hospices, multi-year, with parity across the country, so that those who do that amazing work supporting patients, and so that patients themselves have the support they need and deserve. Thank you.
Dr. Alison Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 20 years ago this month, both my parents died aged 60 of cancer just 1 week apart, but that's where the similarities ended. My father died in a horrible death, receiving very poor, if any, palliative care. My mother won the postcode lottery, if you like, as she passed away in the Royal Stoke in Stoke-on-Trent and received superb care and died a dignified death. I live with the twin... 20 years ago, twin legacies of both of those deaths. And I stress upon the Minister the importance of ensuring that trained palliative care staff are equally spread throughout the country. It is vital, it makes a difference. Stoke-on-Trent has also won the postcode lottery in a way with our excellent hospice, the Dougie Mac. Having merged with the Donna Louise Children's Hospital Hospice, it now provides care across all ages, for all people across North Staffordshire. It provides many innovative services, including a dementia care service and an innovative rapid response service for an ambulance, where we respond to patients who are at the end of their life, and instead of taking them to A&E, they travel to the hospice. This actually saves the local hospital 350 A&E visits a year, saving on ambulances and, of course, saving the trust money. Unfortunately, the hospice does not get any funding to help deliver that service. I do want to take the opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to put on record my thanks to the Chief Exec, who I spoke to at great length just recently, and all the staff across both sites in my constituency, Stoke-on-Trent South, in Blurton and Trentham, for all the work they do, and all of the amazing volunteers in the shops that go throughout Stoke-on-Trent. I welcome the Government's commitment to funding hospices and the £100 million injection, but I support, as with everybody else, that we must end the postcode lottery, we must end the inequity in delivery of service, and we must provide a more sustainable model in the future. Thank you.
Paul Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hospices and palliative care are not just about easing physical pain. They're about dignity, compassion and humanity. How we care for those approaching the end of their life reflects who we are as a society. And as has been mentioned by my right honourable and honourable friends, palliative care should be an integral part of our wider NHS. Over 500,000 people die each year in the UK, yet too many of them do so in conditions that fail to meet their needs or respect their wishes. Hospices, the very sanctuaries of peace and care, are stretched to breaking point. Palliative care teams staffed by dedicated professionals and volunteers do extraordinary work, but they are increasingly underfunded, under-resourced and overlooked in policy debates. These challenges are not the fault of those on the front line. They stem from systemic issues in how we prioritise end-of-life care. Funding for hospices comes primarily from charitable donations, with only about a third provided by the NHS. This is not sustainable, nor is it fair. We would not dream of asking our hospitals or schools to rely on bake sales and fundraisers for their survival. So why should hospices be any different? At this point, I want to pay tribute to, I don't have hospices in my constituency, but local hospices that care for my constituents. The Kirkwood Hospice has budgeted for nearly a £1 million deficit for 23-24 and expect the same level of deficits to continue into subsequent years. The picture is the same for Forget-Me-Not Children's Hospice in Kirklees, which also faces a £1 million shortfall and has put out an urgent appeal for public donations. Another issue is access. Palliative care should be a universal right, yet we know that availability varies widely depending on where you live, your age or your condition. Too many people, particularly in deprived areas or from minority communities, face barriers to receiving the care they need. The inequality is unacceptable in a society that prides itself on fairness and must be addressed by this government. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must ensure secure long-term funding for hospices and palliative care services. This requires a shift in how we think about end-of-life care, not as an optional extra, but as a core part of our healthcare system. The government must step up and provide the sustainable financial support these services need to thrive now and for the future, and be able to support all communities equally. Thank you.
Warren Just.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, I wish to pay tribute to the honourable member from Wimbledon for bringing this debate to the House this evening. Hospices such as Compton Care in my constituency of Wolverhampton West provide invaluable palliative care, not only in terms of pain and symptom control, but they provide psychological, social and spiritual support. They provide support to people who wish to die at home, where that is their wish. They provide rehabilitation, financial advice and support for family members, including bereavement support. The funding that hospices receive from ICBs across the country is inconsistent and often does not reflect the cost of the services that hospices provide. As has already been mentioned, only a third of hospice funding comes from the government, with the rest of the funding coming from charitable donations. As at May last year, at least a fifth of UK hospices had either cut their services in the previous year or were planning to do so. When hospices cut services, the need for care is still there, but then it has to be met by the NHS. If hospices are provided with the long-term support that they need, then that can ease the pressure on the NHS. Sector leaders estimate that the need for palliative care in the UK will increase by 25% over the next 25 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am very much welcome the £100 million funding that the government has provided, which will improve buildings, equipment, accommodation and also digital upgrades, as well as the £26 million revenue funding for children and young people's hospices that will be provided in 2025 to 2026. There has been a lot of discussion about assisted dying this evening, and when we discussed the assisted dying bill, there was a lot of discussion on palliative care. Madam Deputy Speaker, now is the opportunity for us to take action. We need to seize the opportunity to improve palliative care. If the assisted dying bill does become law, we need to make sure that people in the future do not have to make a decision between assisted dying and palliative care.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Palliative and end-of-life care is about dignity, compassion and giving every person their right to live their final days in comfort and peace, as articulated by the Honourable Member for Wimbledon when compassionately describing his parents' last moments. Yet access to high-quality care, as described, and I agree wholeheartedly with my Honourable Member from Stoke-on-Trent and South, is a postcode lottery. Across the UK, only a third of local NHS areas in England can provide 24/7 end-of-life care at home. This leaves almost 100,000 people every year without the care and support they deserve during their most vulnerable moments. We must address this disparity. Every patient deserves a personalised care plan that respects their wishes and supports their physical, emotional, social and spiritual needs. Care plans should also offer non-clinical help. like financial advice and opportunities to participate in meaningful activities while they still can. And let us also not forget the families who require respite and care during this period. Hospices play a vital role in this care. However, unlike the National Health Service, the government does not fully fund hospice care. Hospices only receive about a third of their income from the state. The rest is raised through charitable donations, which is pitiful. This model is unsustainable. Rising costs, which have not been helped by NICS increases, with the sector facing a £60 million deficit this year alone. As demand for hospice care grows due to an ageing population and advances in medicine that help children with life-limiting conditions live longer, the strain on hospices will only increase. Without immediate action, hospices will struggle to meet this growing demand, leaving more people without the care that they deserve. We need bold and decisive steps to fix this. Firstly, fair and sustainable funding. The government must create a national plan to ensure consistent funding for hospices. Emergency funding is urgently needed. A national standard for care, national quality standards and agreed outcomes for palliative and end-of-life care are essential. Every integrated care board must meet minimum standards to provide fair access to care nationwide and support for underserved communities and areas where people are currently missing out. Palliative care should be accessible in homes, care facilities and hospitals, ensuring no one is left behind. And children hospice grants, the £26 million, must be ring-fenced. I would like to thank the incredible team at the 2 hospices in my city who serve my constituency. Loros, who assists 2,500 people a year, and Rainbows, a fabulous organisation who care for young people with life-limiting conditions. I'd like to thank them both. Thank you.
Final Speaker, Brian Matthews.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member from Wimbledon, for bringing this important debate, but also to everyone who's spoken across the House with such compassion. Whilst the £100 million is to be welcomed for hospice capital projects, it is cash that is most needed. Julia's House, a children's hospice, already mentioned in my constituency, will find itself out of pocket by £242,000 per year because of the rise in national insurance. As in fact will Dorothy House Hospice, also in my constituency, which will lose even more. Now that is a lot of sponsored walks, a lot of parachute jumps, perhaps too much, if the hospices are to avoid cutting their services. I urge the Minister to think again and to provide the funds that our hospices need. Thank you.
I call the front bench of the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to start by thanking my honourable friend for Wimbledon for securing today's important debate and for all of the members approaching the conversation with the compassion and thoughtfulness that the topic deserves. Examples shared across the House show that hospices are a vital part of our healthcare system. They provide outstanding care for patients approaching the end of their lives, offering dignity, comfort and support to families, and they're often driven by hundreds of volunteers alongside the paid staff. And they will also play a key role in this government's objective to move care from hospital to community. And this debate is very timely when the front pages of the newspapers are reporting today that 500,000 people were left languishing on trolleys in A&E and in corridors in 2024 because there weren't enough beds to admit them. Hospices like the extraordinary St Wilfrid's in my constituency of Chichester are the cornerstone of community care, and I was blown away during my recent visit to the hospice, and I'm not ashamed to admit was brought to tears by the accounts from family members and patients and the staff that I met that day. So I applaud the member for Stoke-on-Trent South for her show of emotion, because it's an emotive topic. St Wilfrid's in my constituency provides comfort and compassion to patients and their families during life's most challenging moments, both directly in the calm and idyllic surroundings of the hospice and also out in the community, providing palliative care for 300 people in the comfort of their own homes. Now, it is their belief that everybody should be afforded a good death, and they strive to make sure that there is beauty in every day for patients and for their loved ones, and yet their service is being crippled by rising costs and a lack of sufficient government support. Those hospices are in the process of setting their upcoming budgets right now, and many are having to make long-term difficult decisions to cut palliative care because they lack a long-term solution to address the growing financial strain. And just like the Honourable Member for North Herefordshire mentioned, it's all well and good being able to say you've got a lovely car park when you haven't got any nurses to park in it. And only 17% of the overall costs of St Wilfrid's Hospice is currently covered by NHS grant funding, well below the minimum requirement across the country. One of the biggest components of hospice costs is the salary of their expert clerical, clinical and other staff. Hospices are trying to match NHS salary increases to ensure that staff can afford to stay with the hospices and to remain competitive. And in addition, they are now burdened with paying the increased national insurance contributions, while direct NHS providers are exempt. For St Wilfrid's, this rise in national insurance contributions will cost an additional £210,000. That is a significant financial burden. Now, while we as Liberal Democrats and hospices alike welcomed the recent capital investment announcement in December 2024, this funding does not address the challenges of day-to-day spend. So there is still a vast gulf between rising expenses and available income. And as the member for Birmingham, Erdington, said, this funding must be the start, not the end. Hospice UK has warned that around 300 hospice inpatient beds, which is 14% of the total, are currently closed or out of use due to a lack of funding and chronic staff shortages, meaning fewer patients are able to access the end-of-life care that they need at one of the most vulnerable times in their lives. The Honourable Member for Twickenham mentioned the Marie Curie report, as did other members across the House, that stated that 1 in 4 who need hospice care cannot currently get it. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the term bed blocking is not one I'm particularly comfortable with, but if adequate palliative care is unavailable in the community or in a hospice, then those people remain stuck in hospital, and those hospitals cannot provide the care, the expert care that a hospice can. Our hospices are ready and willing to take on those patients, but need the support of this government to do so. And as the Honourable Member for Wimbledon, who brought forward this debate, said, people do not want to die in hospital. They want to die at home, or they want to die in a specialised setting like a hospice. Now, this is why the Liberal Democrats are calling for hospices to be exempted from the rise in national insurance contributions. This targeted measure would provide immediate relief for a sector that is struggling under the weight of rising costs and prevent further reductions in capacity or even closures. We must think long-term. Hospices need a sustainable funding model that guarantees they can continue their vital work, providing care for patients, supporting families and easing the pressure on the NHS. Hospices must also be a part of the conversation in the government's upcoming 10-year plan for the NHS, and that must include sustainable hospice funding reform. Examples from across the House today showed a shared recognition of the importance of hospice care. Now we need the government to match that recognition for action, for the patients, for the families and for a health service that depends on hospices. Thank you.
I call the Shadow Minister, Dr Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the member for Wimbledon for securing this debate. I set off and I was going to test the patience of the House by reading all the hospices that were named, but when we've got to 45 and time is so short, I won't try the patience. But I think it's a testament to see how many examples we've had in this House that members have brought that speak so fondly about the services that they have. Now, responding as His Majesty's opposition, I'd like to discuss 3 areas. Firstly, the conversation about death. Second, the palliative services in the ecosystem. And thirdly, specific technical questions. Because when it comes to the conversation, it's rare that in this House we debate a topic that impacts everyone, literally. And so it's an honour to play my part in highlighting something I've long argued isn't talked about nearly enough. That's death and dying. We all know the only certainty is death, unless that's variable. And the variable part is the quality. And that's what it's come down to for the focus of today's debate. After all, it was Woody Allen who said, "I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens." Now, palliative care services dedicate their lives to making sure people who will die do so with dignity. And many people often think of hospitals or hospices in death and the staff that do the fantastic work, but we mustn't forget the pivotal role the likes of district nurses and GPs play ensuring there is palliative care in our nation. In my constituency, I'm blessed with hospice care from Loros for adults and Rainbows for children, both who are much loved by the public and, most importantly, supported by armies of volunteers, people who deserve this house's recognition and the public's recognition and respect for just what they do to contribute to our society. Now, dying can be a difficult subject to talk about, and I know from my clinical days, but that doesn't make it any less important. So I pay tribute to this House in the way in which it handled and discussed the assisting dying debate. And whatever position you took, it's fantastic to see a national debate now taking place up and down dinner tables of this country. So my first question to the government is, what is being done to ensure that people look to plan their deaths better? Now, when we talk about the wider ecosystem, we've got to consider the roles of hospices, hospitals, and primary care providers like district nurses, who are all key stakeholders. And by the very nature how they've ended up being involved in palliative care, they came from different journeys to do so. Now, it's beyond this debate, but it's so important because it informs the makeup and patchwork of palliation across this country. As we've heard, there's a balance between the charitable funding and the NHS funding. And even this House is divided on what that formula should look like, whether it should be solely state-funded or charitable. So my second question to the government is, would the government consider consulting on a long-term funding model that allows this debate to take place so that we have a better balance between the two? And building on this, looking at it from the clinical part of the issue at play is what that provision should even look like. So my third question is, will the government commit to establishing agreed basic standard criteria for service level provisions and getting a national agreement for the provision of palliative care services and what they look like for whatever a person should choose? Now, it comes to the record of the last government. We were the government that legislated in the Health and Social Care Act in 2022 to ensure that there was commissioning taking place. As part of the NHS response to COVID, 350 million was given to support hospices in those difficult times. The NHS England also put in grant funding for a 24/7 palliative care single care point access support, and also increased the funding, as we've heard, from the Children's Hospice grant from £15 million in 2020-2021 to £25 million, and I'm pleased to see the government continue that trajectory. To help manage staff, this was the government that brought forward the first ever NHS workforce plan, and I'd like to commend the government again for continuing to commit to that. However, with the debate about assisted dying and the concerns expressed by the Health Secretary about provision, my fourth question is, what assessment has the government made about the impact of assisted dying on provision? Because I believe the Secretary of State was commissioning work on this. And when will it release the results? So when it comes to assisted dying and the ability to provide the services, this isn't the right place to suggest whether they are right or wrong. But I hope that whatever happens with this bill, whether it passes or not, we do not let that distract us from the mission of continuing to improve palliative care and end-of-life services. The momentum is both here in this House and in the general public. Now, turning to the specific questions from the sector, it would be remiss of me not to raise the concerns about Labour's budget and the impact on the palliative care sector. The national insurance contribution increases on employers is a tax on charities. Fact. They are not covered by the NHS exemption. Hospices are charity. They are being taxed. Fact. GPs provide palliative care and support. They are not covered by the NHS exemption. They are being taxed. Fact. And Hospice UK have estimated that an additional £30 million will need to be found. This means that charities and non-profit organisations like Sue Ryder, Macmillan, Marie Curie are being hit with additional wage bills requiring more money just to provide the same level of care. Now, the government has said that it will give £100 million to hospices, but it's been made abundantly clear in this debate that is for capital expenditure only, unless the Minister would like to correct me. So when it comes to the spending review, what assessment has the government made of what this will look like when it comes to palliation? Because it's hard not to see that this looks like a Labour government that's giving on one hand while taking on another, taxing GPs, taxing hospices to give them back money in a way they don't want it. Could I ask the Minister on this topic of staffing and contracts as well? Some staff are employed by the NHS, while others are directly employed by hospices themselves. Has the government made an assessment of what this has when it comes to recruitment, what the impact it is? For example, palliative care consultants have a postcode lottery of terms. Would the government consider looking at this? Which throws up another issue and oddity in the sector. Given those contractual arrangements, when it comes to indemnity, some NHS palliative care consultants have Crown indemnity, while others employed by hospices don't, costing them thousands of pounds. Would the government consider looking at this? Turning specifically to the allocation of funding, I'd like to raise the process. Together for Short Lives have called on the government to confirm whether the £26 million would be ring-fenced for Children's Hospital and distributed centrally to avoid delays. Now, previously, the decision was made to give it to ICBs to better help local decision-making, but this has, as a result, while well-meaning, mean there can be delays. So is the government aware of this issue? And if so, would the Minister commit to working to smooth this out? In conclusion, there's much more I could say on this topic, and I'm sure many others could do too. We know that the UK has an ageing population and that demand for palliative care will continue to rise over the next decades to come. But here in this House, we have the opportunity to make a difference for all who come after us. After all, at the heart of looking after dying comes compassion. True compassion means not only feeling another's pain, but being so moved to help relieve it. And this government has the power to do so. And I hope in turn they will.
I call the Minister, Stephen Kinnock.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to pay tribute, first of all, to the Honourable Member for Wimbledon for securing this debate and for making such a powerful and thoughtful opening speech. I'd also like to thank Honourable Members from right across the House. Too many to list, and it would be impossible, I think, to capture the richness of the contributions that were made. I think we had something like 28 backbench speeches, although I'm sure Madam Deputy Speaker might correct me on that if I didn't quite catch all of the numbers. But it really was an excellent debate, and I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all those who work or volunteer in the hospice and palliative care sector for the deeply compassionate care and support that they provide to patients, families and loved ones when they need it most. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is committed to building a society where every person receives high-quality, compassionate care from diagnosis through to the end of life. We will therefore shift more care out of hospitals and into the community to ensure patients and their families receive personalised care in the most appropriate setting, and palliative and end-of-life care services, including hospices, will of course have a vital role to play in this shift. Now, the reality is we have a mountain to climb. Our health and care services are on their knees, but this government will strain every sinew to build them and to create a health and care system that is once again fit for the future. In England, Madam Deputy Speaker, integrated care boards are responsible for the commissioning of palliative and end-of-life care services to meet the needs of their local populations. To support ICBs in this duty, NHS England has published statutory guidance and service specifications. Whilst the majority of palliative and end-of-life care is provided by NHS staff and services, we recognise the vital part that voluntary sector organisations, including hospices, also play in providing support to people at end of life as well as to their loved ones. Most hospices are charitable, independent organisations which receive some statutory funding for providing NHS services. The amount of funding each charitable hospice receives varies both within and between ICB areas. This variation is dependent on demand in that area and also on the totality and type of palliative and end-of-life care provision from both NHS and non-NHS services, including charitable hospices within each ICB footprint. Now, we understand the financial pressures hospices have been facing, which is why last month I was truly proud that this government announced the biggest investment into hospices in England in a generation, ensuring that hospices in England can continue to deliver the highest quality end-of-life care possible for their patients, families and loved ones.
And I also welcome that, and I congratulate the Minister on getting that money out of the Treasury, but will he acknowledge that there is a difference between capital and revenue, and what these hospices really urgently need is support for their day-to-day running costs, not just more money to support the capital that they also need, but is less crucial?
Well, I take his point, but of course hospices face a range of pressures, and the capital expenditure injection that we have provided is going to help them in the round. So clearly, anything that helps the budget of a hospice is going to help it in the round, whether it's capital or revenue. We're supporting the hospice sector with a £100 million capital funding boost for adult and children's hospices to ensure that they have the best physical environment for care, as well as £26 million in revenue funding to support children and young people's hospices. The £100 million in capital funding will help support hospices and deliver much-needed funding for improvements, from refurbishments to overhauling IT systems and improving facilities for patients and visitors during the remainder of 2024-25 and throughout 25-26. This investment will go towards helping hospices to improve their buildings, equipment and accommodation to ensure patients continue to receive the best care possible. Hospices for children and young people will also receive a further £26 million revenue funding for 25-26 through what until recently was known as the Children's Hospice Grant. This investment demonstrates how this government recognises the importance of integrating services to improve the treatment that patients receive. Furthermore, through our plans for neighbourhood health centres, we will drive the shift of care from hospital into the community, bringing together existing palliative care services, including hospices, alongside community care services, so people have the best access to treatment through joined-up services. We will set out the...
On the basis that money isn't always the only solution, can my right honourable friend please confirm how the commission that the government also announced last month on palliative care will improve end-of-life care?
The government announced a commission into the future of adult social care. There is a separate commission that's been announced, I think, by my honourable friend, the member for York Central, on palliative care, and we will certainly be monitoring and watching very closely the findings of that commission. We're going to set out details of the funding which, if you just 1 second, I'll just make a little bit of progress. We will set out the details of the funding allocation and distribution mechanisms for both funding streams in the coming weeks.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Minister, whenever I was making my contribution, I referred to the Northern Ireland Hospice. In particular, I made the House aware of their circumstances, which is they have to cut their beds from 7 to 6, 5 days a week, and at the weekend only 3. Now, it's all very well, Minister, and I respect the Minister greatly, he knows that, to have capital money available. But if there isn't the money to actually run the system and provide the beds, I mean, for instance, you could buy the beds, but you couldn't actually run them and keep them. So there must be something seriously wrong with what the Minister is putting forward.
Well, I thank the honourable member, but as I said in a previous answer, the hospices are facing a range of pressures. Financial contributions from the government will help to ease those pressures. That will, of course, have a knock-on impact across the budgets of hospices in the round. But in spite of the record-breaking package that we have announced, I'll just make some progress, we are certainly not complacent. We know there is more work to be done, and through the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the department is investing £3 million in a policy research unit in palliative and end-of-life care. This unit launched in January 2024 and is building the evidence base place that will inform our long-term strategy. I know a number of honourable members have requested a long-term strategy and a long-term plan. That it is sorely missing after 14 years of Conservative neglect and incompetence. I agree with them, we need that long-term plan. I can assure them that conversations are taking place now between my officials and with NHS England. But some of this research, it needs to be based on evidence and facts, and that this unit is going to help us to get some of that.
So I thank you very much for giving way, and I think it's important this debate isn't a political ding-dong, and I really appreciate the tone at which he's approaching this and everyone has in this debate. On evidence and facts, will he look into the impact of the national insurance contribution rises on hospice care and provision, and could he look into how many hospices are running in deficits and how many are likely to go into it as a result of his policies?
The honourable gentleman won't be surprised to know that I have a section in my speech on employers' national insurance contributions, and I'll get to that now. But the point I was making about facts, a number of colleagues raised concerns about regional variations. The facts and the evidence are very important in that context. But on addressing that issue, NHS England has developed a palliative and end-of-life care dashboard which brings together all relevant local data in one place. The dashboard helps commissioners understand the palliative and end-of-life care needs of their local population, enabling ICBs to put plans in place to address and track the improvement of health inequalities and ensure that funding is distributed fairly based on prevalence. I will give way to the honourable gentleman, but I would say to colleagues I have to finish at 9:58, so there's about 5 minutes left of my contribution.
It's very generous of the Minister giving way, so I shall be brief. Could he just confirm whether, in his view, he would see this funding continue to be produced through the ICBs, or whether he sees it as a centrally funded system?
That is precisely the topic of conversation for officials in my department and NHS England, looking in the round at this issue and deciding how we're going to work. We've got to have a system which empowers ICBs to deliver at the coalface of what they're actually doing, but we need to also have accountability from the centre to make sure that things are being delivered. Getting that balance right is never an easy process, as I'm sure the honourable gentleman will understand, and that is what we're trying to navigate at the moment. Alongside NHS England, I'll just make some progress. Alongside NHS England, my officials and I will continue to proactively engage with our stakeholders, including the voluntary sector and independent hospices, on an ongoing basis to understand the issues that they face. In fact, I'll be meeting with the major hospices and palliative care stakeholders, including Hospice UK, early next month to discuss potential solutions for longer-term sector sustainability, which will inform our 10-year health plan.
Thank the Minister for giving way. On the Children's Hospice grant, will he confirm that it will be ring-fenced and that it will be beyond the one-year settlement that he has granted?
Again, that is precisely on the agenda for the discussions that are happening with officials. Having inherited a disastrous situation, we are using 25-26 to stabilise, to try and enable this sector to survive. The Honourable Lady will understand that as well as doing that, we're now looking at long-term reform solutions. But when we came into power on the 4th of July, it was 1 minute to midnight, and we had to rescue the sector. That is what we're doing. That is what we're doing, and we will look at the long-term issues in due course. Now, a number of members have raised this concern around employers' national insurance contributions. Since we came to office in July, we've been completely focused on repairing the catastrophic legacy of 14 years of Conservative neglect and incompetence. The first step was to fix the foundations of the public finances at the autumn budget, and this enabled the spending review settlement of £22.6 billion increase in resource spending for our health and care system. Our approach to ENIC exemptions has been consistent with the ONS definition and the approach taken by previous governments. This does not include an exemption for independent contractors, including charities like hospices, although December's record funding announcement was a clear recognition of our commitment to financially supporting the vital sector more broadly. But I do have to ask honourable members from all parties opposite who luxuriate in criticising the means by which we have raised the record funding for hospices, what would they do? How would they have raised the £22 billion that our autumn budget delivered? Which taxes would they raise? Or which public services would they cut? Answer comes there none, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the government recognises the need to protect the smallest businesses and charities like hospices, which is why we have more than doubled the employment allowance to £10,500, meaning more than half of businesses and charities with ENIC liabilities either gain or see no change next year. While this debate is not about assisted dying, Madam Deputy Speaker, I did want to say a word on that. My honourable friend, the member for Spen Valley, has put forward her bill and it's received its second reading. It's vital that our approach to end-of-life care and patient choice is holistic and driven by an in-depth understanding of patient need. Thank you to thank everybody across the House for this excellent debate. Actions speak louder than words. This government has acted to deliver the biggest financial contribution to hospices in a generation.
I call Paul Kohler to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank everyone for contributing today. This is a vital issue, and the sheer number of speakers who spoke at such short notice shows how important it is to the House. We've heard many excellent contributions, but I won't try Madam Speaker's patience by listing them. The one motive running through so many of the speeches was a need for a long-term funding plan. I heard what the Minister said about the £3 million NICE investment and establishing a long-term strategy. I fear it sounds like a plan for a plan, but I will hold him to his word, look forward to the 10-year health plan, because we absolutely need a strategy for the next 10 years, not the next 2 years, but I will hold him to his word. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as their opinions say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it.